From the Asgard Company Studios in beautiful Wichita Falls, Texas, from the finest mind in the modern fitness industry, the one true voice in the strength and conditioning profession, the most important podcast on the internet. Ladies and gentlemen, starting Strength Radio.
Thank you, Mark Wolf. Welcome back to Starting Strength Radio. We have a interesting show for you this week, and something I think you'll find fascinating, especially if you're a guy. We're going to talk about B-52s and the Cold War with our friend Scott Davison. But first, as usual, comments from the haters. All right, now this is going to be specifically in response to the Olympic weightlifting show that we just recently ran. Zach Thielander says, please, for the love of God, put this on your comments from the haters segment this week. I almost left it out just because he asked to be on. But I think this is funny. I would like a list of all the lifters in the past 10 years you have coached at any meet in weightlifting and their totals. And while we're at it, let's do powerlifting too. You piss and moan about the current state of American weightlifting as if you haven't had the ability to come in and actually do something about it. You got your level 1 in 89, for God's sakes. There is no coach in American weightlifting that doesn't have their athletes pull, squat, and press. You haven't. Many times I've heard that. There's no coach that doesn't actively try to develop strength in their lifter. What the fuck am I missing here? You, sir, are missing the facts and the video that explains all this shit. That's what you're missing. Oh, God. And here's Rusty. All right, here's a comment from Travis C. Rusty never drops the soap.
I put it down gently.
Rusty never drops the soap. I want Rippetoe to coach me, but I'm not a female, says. It's in some other script. I can't read the alphabet. It doesn't look like Cyrillic. You think it's Cyrillic? Maybe Greek? I don't have any idea what this is.
Like Russian to me.
No, it's not. It's not Greek. It's not Greek.
Is it Russian?
I don't think so, unless it's some weird font it's displayed in.
Yeah.
Because I only coach females. Okay. All right, this is especially interesting. French Bulldog says, somebody tell me, what is the point of doing this crap? Self-gratification seems rather vain and self-centered. I get that the teacher makes money, but all the students are guaranteed to have joint problems later in life. There is no point. Just a bunch of foolish people with blinders on. French Bulldog 1 makes that insightful observation. All right. And finally, why are Mark's nipples no longer hard? I cannot trust this man now. Fucking infuriating. I'm getting married tomorrow, and now I seriously doubt I'll be able to consummate the marriage. Fuck you, Rippetoe, you sick fuck. We really upset Perry Migas.
Congratulations on the marriage.
Yes, congratulations, Perry. And those are comments from the haters. All right, Scotty, thanks for coming in.
Sure.
You and I have been buddies for, 20, 25 years?
It's 20 years anyway.
Something like that. We got to know each other through politics and stuff. Everybody I know is a libertarian, I think, or is headed in that direction one way or another. And at one time, Scott used to write a column for our little paper that's somehow still clinging to life here, the Wichita Falls Times Record News. Those guys run like one original article today. They finally, I think they primarily serve as have you looked at the paper?
No, and since they fired me, I haven't bothered looking at it.
I haven't read it in years. Picked it up in an office one day, and it appeared that it's wire stories, and they may have one person in the office down there.
Yeah, that's what it seems like when I look at it.
Yeah, it seems like one person's working down there. And, they write these stories that are where each sentence is a paragraph.
Right.
Modern journalism. Each sentence is its own paragraph because you're too stupid to read a multi-sentence paragraph. Have y'all noticed the tendency for that? Yeah, I think the bigger papers, tend to write more in like actual paragraphs, but they're all lying to you, so it doesn't really make any difference. So, Scotty is here, and I'm going to let him introduce himself to you. Scott has got the best stories on earth, and he was a B-52 pilot back during the Cold War. And you guys are in for a treat. So, Scott, tell us.
Well, what do you want to know?
When did you go into the service?
I got commissioned out of the University of Minnesota in 1974.
Mm-hmm.
So I was picked up on a pilot scholarship program during the Vietnam War, and they needed pilots. And if you could pass a physical, that was no draft physical, it was a honest-to-God physical, and score a certain level on written tests, then they would pay for your college. So
great deal.
I said, yeah, that's better than slugging it through a rice paddy with an M16, which is
where you'd have been,
yeah.
Right.
So so I got commissioned in '74, and I moved to Mississippi. My first duty station was Keesler Air Force Base for schools.
But the program, the idea is that the program had started.
Right. I started my senior in high school in '69.
Yeah, so you
I
committed
was
to the
worried,
program.
Yeah. I had actually enlisted as a reserve E1 in the spring of '70.
Right in the middle of the deal. Okay, I got it.
Yeah, that was the hammer they held over you in college.
Right.
If your grades fell, then they sent you off to Lackland as an E1 basic trainee.
Right.
So you had to be enlisted while you were in college.
Right.
So they carried you as a reserve E1.
Right. I see. So you entered flight school in '74.
Actually started in '75, early '75. There was a delay because Vietnam was all winding down.
Right.
There was a delay getting us started and everything. And some guys didn't go at all. Some guys were told you had a free education, see ya. And some of those guys were thrilled, because they joined ROTC to hoping the war would be over before they graduated, basically.
And
it was.
And they got lucky.
Right.
Yeah.
So I started pilot training in February of '75 at Columbus Air Force Base, Mississippi. Mm-hmm. Pilot training lasted 54 weeks, I think was what it was. I think. Because of the war winding down, it was pretty brutal. They washed out half the class.
Oh, God. Oh, my.
Yeah, it was the first 6 months, it seemed like somebody was leaving every day.
So it was a higher quality group of graduates at that point.
Well, I like to think so.
The standards had been raised by the supply-demand curve.
Yeah, air sickness washed out a bunch of guys.
Yeah.
There was just, nowadays they cure air sickness.
Right.
Got about 95% cure rate on it. But in those days, they just used it as a reason to get rid of you.
Right.
Because they just wanted to thin it out anyway.
Right.
We had guys from Venezuela in the class and guys from Denmark in the class. A lot of people don't know that, but the U.S. Air Force trains pilots from people all over the world.
Not just NATO.
Right, not just NATO. NATO, the program here, which we'll get to later, I guess, is a very unique program. At the other pilot training bases, countries just write a check to the American taxpayers and say, give us back an American-trained pilot. Right. Here at NJEP, all the countries have input into the syllabus and everything. So it's a completely different thing. But the Danes were at the top of the class. They showed up with 100 hours in other jets before they even started, so they were ahead of everybody. The Venezuelans were like the Americans. Some were real good, some weren't. Mm-hmm. I believe they were all politically favorable at the time. I think they knew people, and that's why they were there, I think. But the guy I shared a table with for the whole year was a Venezuelan, guy named Gabino Blanco. Sad thing is, the class has had several reunions. The Venezuelans have all disappeared. None of them have ever had a Facebook account. None of them have had an email address.
Disappeared.
I mean, literally disappeared.
Went away.
And I'm afraid that after the socialist revolution down there, that they're not with us anymore. I don't know that. I'm just saying we've never
very well be.
Yeah, we've never had any contact with any of them.
Right.
So, so I graduated in '76, then the bicentennial year, and I had to sit at Columbus for some months because of the way the funding worked for follow-on schools. Because when you finish pilot training, what you have is a pair of pilot wings and nothing else. You're still no good to anybody.
Right.
And so you start by going to survival schools. There was a water survival school, mountain survival school, and then eventually,
in case you get shot down, that
right,
sort of thing.
Yeah, right. In different climates and stuff. There's POW resistance training where they taught you how to resist interrogations and stuff. And then I finally got to Castle Air Force Base, California, to start training as a co-pilot in the B-52.
So when did you receive the assignment to the B-52? Does that come during pilot training?
It comes right at just before graduation.
Right. So they tell you what kind of plane you're going to fly.
You put in about 4 months before graduation, you put in a dream sheet. This is what I'd like to do.
Right.
And they'll pay some attention to it, but they tell you from the beginning the needs of the Air Force, so it determines what your assignment's going to be.
Right. So what was on your dream sheet?
I actually, the one thing I knew is I didn't want to fly fighters.
Really?
Yeah, everybody else wanted to fly fighters.
That kind of made you unusual.
Oh, yeah, very, yeah. They kept bringing in fighter pilots to impress us, and I found them so universally obnoxious that and it's out now. I got a lot of very good friends that are fighter pilots now, so that was then, guys.
Yeah,
But
I know the type.
Plus
having lived in Wichita Falls all these years.
Plus the formation flying wasn't a lot of fun for me. I could do it. I passed the check, right, but it wasn't. Everybody else talked how much fun they were having. Right. And I just wasn't having all that much fun in formation. And if you fly fighters, you got to fly in formation. A single fighter in combat's dead meat. So put that all together. I said I still want combat airplanes. So what that meant in 1976 was AC-130s or B-52s.
Right.
That's it. And the AC-130s, they got most of their co-pilots out of the C-130 world. So they're already trained how to fly the airplane.
What is the AC-130?
That's a gunship. Still using them.
Oh yeah, all right.
It's an awesome weapon.
It's the side-mounted gun. Yeah.
They got machine guns and cannon mounted out the side, and with modern technology, they can snipe with them.
Didn't that concept start in Vietnam?
It did.
With a C-47.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fitted with some kind of hairy ass cannon of some sort.
Yeah, it had. I worked for a guy who flew those in Vietnam. His had 3 7.62 miniguns. The Vulcan Gatling gun.
Rotating.
And then it had a 75 millimeter howitzer.
Okay.
He said they'd shoot that howitzer and that whole plane would go sideways.
Got him. A howitzer on an airplane. That's an amazing.
It was a deadly weapon too.
Oh yeah. And
he said the thermal sights on it they're very crude, and he said you couldn't really tell the difference between an elephant and a truck. So he said that one of the things you do, because of course they exclusively flew at night. He says if the sights found those things, he says you'd fire a round out of that 75 down there, and if they moved immediately, then they were elephants.
Then you left them alone.
Right. And the truck drivers learned, they didn't know how, but they knew that we were finding those trucks in the dark. So as soon as they stop them, they'd go somewhere else and leave the truck alone.
Right. So it would just stand there and not move. I wonder how many elephants got killed.
Yeah, he laughed about that. He said I hope the pearly gates aren't guarded by elephants. Sooner or later, you kill somebody.
You're going to kill an elephant or two. Oh, God. So the B-52 was your other option.
Right. And I did a little research, and I found out there was 3 models still on duty at the time. The D model, the G model, and the H model. And the H model had fan jets. It was the last one produced.
Right.
And so I asked for those to Grand Forks Air Force Base, North Dakota.
So let's talk about the B-52 a little bit. This is an incredibly interesting airplane. Those of you people that are listening to us now, we get to talk about airplanes. One of my favorite things to do is just get on Wikipedia and look at airplanes. And I can do that for 2 hours. I can just read about airplanes for 2 hours. And I don't know why it fascinates me so much, but Wikipedia is a good resource for airplane stuff. And the B-52, the first airframes were produced in 1950.
The very first flight was 52.
1952.
But they started entering service in 55.
Right. They tested the airplane off the ground at Boeing in 1952.
Right.
And it is still in service today.
It is. The H models are all that's left.
And so that is what? 70 years?
Yeah.
Coming up on 70 years?
It's going to end up being in service for 85, 90 years before they retire.
That's just, there's not another airplane.
Nothing comes close to it.
I mean, that is even approached it. Most of these things have a lifespan of 7 or 8 years.
Military planes, yeah, if you're lucky, 7 or 8 years.
7 or 8 years, and the B-52 is almost 70 years old. And is that because the original design was just so damn good?
That's part of it. Plus, they've never really asked for a replacement.
What else could do that mission?
Well, that's the problem.
As well as what we've got right now.
Yeah, historically, what matters in a bomber is range and payload. That's what matters. And the Air Force has never asked for more range and payload. They wanted the B-1, which for speed and maneuverability, it's a remarkably fast and maneuverable airplane for a plane its size. But it doesn't, in actual combat, carry more weight. And it's very range limited. It takes 2 times, 3 times the tanker support. So they're going to retire the B-1s long before they retire the B-52s. And the same with the B-2s. Nobody knows exactly when they're going to retire.
But they won't last 70 years.
No way. No way. And that stealth technology, which I don't know anything about it, all I know is it's fragile. They can't fly those things on every training sort of. I mean, they basically only fly combat missions on them.
Oh, really?
There's some exceptions.
Just wears the airplane out?
Yeah, and I don't understand what it is about it that wears out.
Right.
But it does.
It's interesting. B-52s, on the other hand, what do you think the oldest B-52 airframe in the air right now is? When would
probably 1960, probably. I'm off the top of my head.
1960.
Yeah.
They were building H models in 1960.
In fact, the last one was delivered, if I remember right, in early '61, and we had that airplane up at Grand Forks while it was up there.
The last manufactured by Boeing.
Yeah, we also had the one that had the famous flight without a tail, where they lent a B-52 to NASA, right? And NASA was going to do, I think it was mountain wave turbulence research with it, I think is what it was. So they instrumented the plane all up, flew it in the mountain. I think their first encounter, it knocked the vertical stabilizer and rudder off, just broke it off like a toy.
The wind?
Yeah, the side loads. Yeah,
really,
just ripped it off. There's a lot of photos you get online. You see about it. They left a little stub of the vertical stabilizer there, but they lowered the aft landing gear to provide a little stability, and they went looking for a place where the wind was down the runway. And if I remember right, they went back and landed at Edwards, where they took off from in California, if I remember right. But
they got all the way back there without a vertical impact.
Only airplane ever built could fly like that. It's an amazingly tough airplane. Boeing just builds good airplanes, despite their current problems right now.
Apparently, they have in the past. 1961, they took delivery of that's the newest B-52 airframe.
I think it was 61, yes.
That is just absolutely amazing. And you and I were talking the other day about the difference between the G and the H model, and apparently there was a big upgrade between G and H. So you got A, B, C, D.
Well, the big
was E a designation?
Oh yes, yeah.
E model.
They had A through H. Right. The real big change was from the F to the G.
F to G.
Right. That was a total redesign of the airplane.
All right.
The external layout looks generally similar.
Right.
Somebody who's got time looking at them can tell right at it with a glance. So all those early ones, we started calling them tall tails, because the vertical stab was 10 or 12 feet taller and more pointed looking.
Right.
So the G model, externally, the G model is easy to identify because by comparison, it looks like the top of the vertical stabilizer has been cut off of it. If you're used to looking at it. Then the H model is basically a G model with fan jets and a different tail gun initially.
Right.
Don't have any guns on them anymore. But initially, it was built with a 20 millimeter Gatling gun in the tail, and every other B-52 had 450 caliber machine gun.
So the basic upgrade of this thing was that the G is the wings are wet.
Yes, the wings are fuel tanks.
This is a fascinating design concept, isn't it? the wings of an F model, a G model B-52 do not contain fuel tanks. They are fuel tanks.
Yeah, for practical purposes, we say there's tanks in them.
Right.
For the Copilot to handle the fuel, we break it up into tanks.
Right.
But if you have a leak on a G or an H model, you have structural damage. If you're leaking fuel, you have damage to the structure. And then the top,
because the tank itself is loaded aerodynamically because it's the wing.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And for that reason, you never ever empty a B-52 out because the fuel's part of the structure of it. And then the top, 1/4 or so of the fuselage for almost its entire length is also fuel.
Right.
So it's a fuel truck.
Right.
Max gross weight when I flew them was 488,000 pounds peacetime, and over 300,000 of that could be fuel. So, and
that's irrespective of bomb payload, or is that?
Well, no, that would depend. If you fully load it up with 65 or 70,000 pounds of fuel of bombs, you may not be able to fill up the fuel tanks.
So 480 was the max.
488 was the max
load
peacetime
at takeoff.
weight. Yeah, max gross weight at takeoff, peacetime.
Peacetime.
And we sat on alert with 500,000, and when they came out with the external cruise missiles, we sat on alert with, I want to say it was 520,000 pounds of gross weight.
So you could get airborne at 520,000.
Yes, you could, unless it was real hot, or you had a tailwind that you couldn't avoid, something like that. But yeah, it would fly, but I tell you, it flew heavy. It's already the hardest fly airplane ever built. And when you got heavy.
You have told me before that flying a B-52 is like flying a building.
Oh yeah, it's like sitting on your front porch or flying your house. What was the old? I can't remember that they used to say it has 152 miles of wiring in it. It weighs more than 10 locomotives and can deliver more than 60 boxcars. And it flies like 10 locomotives pulling 60 boxcars at the end of 120 miles of wire. I learned on my what in the Air Force we call a dollar ride. Your first ride in any airplane that you're going to fly is called a dollar ride. And I learned on my dollar ride, which was 5.5 hours long, that nothing I learned for a year of pilot training about stick rudder and throttle was going to help me in this airplane. It just doesn't behave like other airplanes.
It's not the same thing.
It's not at all. Not at all. Had to relearn everything. So the only thing I learned at pilot training I was going to use was instrument procedures because they always apply to everybody.
Right.
So, but as far as how to fly, how to manipulate controls on an airplane, pilot training didn't teach me anything I needed in the B-52.
Right.
Basic laws of aerodynamics, maybe, but.
Well, this is just, I don't, those of us civilians that have had no experience with this, but have had a fascination for this kind of hardware for a long time. The B-52 there's nothing that's ever been able to do that mission. The damn thing can drop bombs on your ass from 30,000 feet or from 500 feet.
Yep, or less.
Or less. Imagine flying a building 500 feet, 400 feet above the ground. So there's a wide variety of missions this thing was suitable for. What's the highest a bomb can be dropped? Is that still classified?
No. During Desert Storm, our unit routinely bombed from 41,000 feet.
Drop the payload from 41,000 feet.
Yep.
And what is the lowest that you have ever dropped payload?
I've dropped 108 500-pound bombs from 200 feet. One wingspan for us.
200 feet.
Yep. At 390 knots.
And the bomb explosion, what's the velocity? You have to have some ground speed there to get away from them.
You always drop what we call high drags from the low altitude.
Right.
So there's a drag device on each bomb that makes sure that it falls behind you before it goes off. But inevitably, a couple of those will do what we call going slick, and that those high drag devices won't deploy.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was always disconcerting to look at any videotape because there'd be one or two of those bombs would skip off the ground and go halfway back up to the plane.
To 100 feet.
Before they finally detonated.
Right.
And first time I looked at that, I thought, well, I didn't even know that. That was.
So what would that damage the aircraft?
Not usually. No, not usually. It would be far enough behind you.
What's your ground speed in a situation like that?
Bomber airspeed is normally 390 knots, so 425
At 200
miles an
feet
hour.
off the deck?
Oh yeah, or less. Some of the routes had no minimum altitude at all. I got discovered by an F-15 one time on a red flag mission because we were kicking up dust on the desert floor. That's how he saw us.
Wow.
And that's when I realized you can go too low. that didn't
So
help
you're
me.
like half a wingspan off of the
Oh
ground.
yeah, it gets scary. You can't make
You
any
can't
mistakes.
sneeze.
No.
You can't do anything. You can't-
Yeah. That's why you didn't routinely do that.
It's just amazing. Can you imagine being on the ground underneath a B-52 flying over your head at 100 feet? What in the hell?
Yeah. I can't tell you how many times I've crossed an interstate highway or something, at 300 or 400 feet above ground level, and often wondered what those people in the cars.
Oh my God! Can you imagine having? Because you're not going to see it.
No.
You're driving down a highway, you're looking ahead, and all of a sudden, oh God Almighty!
It must be frightening. I don't know.
Oh, I bet it is.
But
I'll bet it is, man.
I've been on the base back in the late 80s, somebody decided we weren't getting enough live releases of actual weapons coming off the airplane because there wasn't that very many places you could drop a lot of bombs in the U.S. And
Right.
so
Nevada, poor old Nevada.
yeah, there's a place called Utah Test Range outside of Salt Lake City. So that's where I dropped the
I wonder
108.
how many pounds of explosives have been dropped on that damn thing.
Incalculable.
Yeah.
But we came up with a program in the 80s the pilots quickly called it the Bomb Your Own Base program because they decided we were going to drop what we call shapes or blivets, phony bombs. They're just 5 or 6 feet long, and they're supposed to, or they're not even that, they're 3 or 4 feet long. And evidently they're supposed to mimic the aerodynamic qualities of a conventional bomb. Mm-hmm. And we went out in between the runway and the long parallel taxiways, and we mowed a bullseye in the grass. And then somebody at SAC headquarters went to the FAA and said, we'd like permission to fly 390 knots down through our base and drop a bomb on it. And I'm sure the FAA said no. And I'm sure that somebody at SAC said we're going to do it anyway because we did it.
Because we're SAC and we're
just going to do it.
We are the Strategic Air Command, and in fact, it's already been done.
So we did that. We bombed our own bases for a while to get. Oh, gosh. By today's safety standards, they'd never let you do anything like that anymore.
So
Probably not.
The FAA governs all airspace, even military airspace?
All airspace in 48 contiguous states, yes.
No shit.
Now, the military has airspace set aside for their use, okay? And there's different types. For instance, pilot training occurs in what's called a military operating area, or MOA. And it's not technically restricted from other airplanes. Anybody can fly through there that's otherwise legal to be there. When I was a student, pilot training areas were restricted from other people, but that changed. Politics changed that. Right? So there's a hilarious, our NJEP classes here, that a lot of them will put out a graduation tape on YouTube. And I was watching one here about a year ago, and they had a tape of air traffic control. And there was a civilian pilot asked for permission to enter the Westover military operating area out west of here. And the controller's answer was, well, I can't keep you out of there, he says, but what's in there is unqualified pilots and supersonic jets. Your choice.
Your choice. Well, it's interesting. Oh, God.
But, yeah, they govern airspace around airports and everything, too. There's Class A, B, and C airspace, and there's rules about how fast you can operate and what equipment you got to have. And the Bomb Your Own Base program violated all that. We just did it anyway.
It just
Cold War SAC could do
needed to be done, that sort of thing. What are the dimensions? Just as a little aside here of a 500-pound conventional bomb. How big are those damn things? Like this table?
A Mark 82 is the common one. They're fairly streamlined. They're designed for external carriage on fighters, although we carried them internally and externally. But Mark 82 is the length of this table.
Right.
And is, 3 feet diameter, something like that. And pretty streamlined looking, for the most part.
Shiny, pointy.
Yeah, usually they're olive drab, flat olive drab colored, usually.
Okay.
We also dropped a lot of M117s, which are bigger in diameter. Those are 750 pounders instead of 500 pounders. That's a general purpose explosive, just for buildings and people.
Right, and then they've got all kinds of other vicious little devices that drop flechettes and anti-personnel things.
Cluster bomb units.
That just scare the rat fuck out of everybody that's ever even heard of these damn
things. A lot of that stuff we don't use anymore. Signed treaties and stuff.
Too mean.
Yeah, it's too mean.
Too mean.
We dropped a lot of CBUs during Desert Storm.
CBUs?
Cluster bomb units. It looks like a regular bomb, basically, and when it falls out, it opens up, and hundreds of little tennis ball-sized bomblets come out, each of which is embedded with the BBs and has vanes to make it rotate, and they'll detonate just above the ground, and it's devastating unless you're behind armor, because it'll cut you apart from all directions at once. Just literally turns flesh into hamburger.
It's like being in front of the world's largest shotgun.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh God Almighty!
But I think we've signed something where we're not going to use CBUs anymore. I think. I'm not sure.
Well, I guess those are terribly effective anti-personnel devices.
Oh yeah, you have to be behind armor, or they're going to get you.
The elite Republican Guard probably got treated to a couple of doses of CBUs. Right?
Yeah, we knew the ground war was about to start because all the B-52 targets changed to carpet bombing along the border, and that's your sign that it's going to be a couple days and we're coming after you.
Right.
And that's why these guys were surrendering to drones or anything else they could.
Just
if you survive, you're not a soldier anymore after a couple of days of that. It'll shatter your bladder. It's just terrifying.
Carpet bombing is an interesting process.
Yes, you just try to get as many bombs as you can in as few square feet as you can.
Just churn the earth.
Yep.
So what does it look like after an area has been carpet bombed?
Moonscaped,
Just dirt.
Just nothing but craters.
Just dirt and bomb craters.
You've seen the videos from Vietnam. The B-52s did a lot of carpet bombing there.
Right.
And it's terribly effective. After the war, the North Vietnamese said it was the thing they feared more than anything was a B-52 raid, because there's nothing they could do about it. They didn't know it was coming. And if you're in the target box, nothing survives.
Nothing. Not a tree, not a rat.
Blades of grass don't survive.
Cockroaches don't survive. So how many airplanes would a raid like that involve?
Usually in Vietnam they use 3 ships a lot. They fly a 3-ship V formation. And then each of those guys would have 108 500-pound bombs. So it would take an area half a mile wide, 3/4 mile long, something like that, and just kill everything in it.
Just 324 bombs in an area.
Yep, less than a mile long.
Less than a mile long and half a mile wide.
Yep, you can see videos of it, those strikes happening in the jungle, and the common wisdom at the time was, well, they're just bombing jungle, but no, there was targets down there. There were supply lines, supply
just
depots.
Bomb the jungle. That'd be wasteful, wouldn't it?
Yeah, they did this. They carpet bombed right outside the wire at Khe Sanh with B-52s. We'll never know how many of the North Vietnamese regulars were killed with those, because that was the whole point of Khe Sanh, was to force them to bring their troops into a fixed place battle.
Right.
Because if they didn't, the artillery base of Khe Sanh was going to cut the supply lines. So it worked. The North Vietnamese had to do this, and the B-52 showed up and just killed them in huge numbers. We'll never know how many.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's a devastating weapon. I think it was.
Those are 500-pound bombs.
Typically, yes. Yeah. I think it was. I may be misquoting. I think it was Napoleon who was asked about artillery, and said, "Do you go for quantity or quality?" And he said, "You always go for quality, remembering that quantity has a quality."
Yes.
Army understands that.
Yeah.
The Army does.
The Army, Marine Corps understands that. Everybody operates artillery understands that everybody on the ground really, really is upset when shit drops out of the sky and blows you to 7 or 8 pieces.
I read a statistic once that in World War II, something like 70% of the casualties were indirect fire casualties, meaning nobody had them in their sights. They lobbed a bomb at them, they dropped artillery shell on them, and it caused way more than half the casualties. Wow. Indirect fire.
Not a sniper round, but a mortar, artillery, bomb.
That kind of thing, yeah.
Right. Well, it's
So doing it from 41,000 feet with hundreds of pounds it's devastating.
well, and there's another very important aspect of the B-52, nuclear weapons. Now, these are fascinating. There is a movie called the Atomic Bomb movie that you can buy on Amazon. It's still available on DVD, and it's the footage of 40 or 50 nuclear weapons tests from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and it's a fascinating look at the power of these ridiculous devices, and we'll talk about this more in a minute. But the Strategic Air Command's mission was to be able to destroy all life on the planet,
Essentially.
and to also at the same time guarantee that it would never be done accidentally, right? So nuclear weapons were the arsenal.
Oh, yeah.
At the time when you used conventional weapons in the Persian Gulf War, but you also flew nukes around.
Didn't fly them around. That rarely happened on a bomber.
Right. So tell us about this.
Well, you would sit on alert. That was the primary job of bomber crews and tanker crews during the Cold War. Which, like you mentioned earlier, there's a whole generation is raised after that ended. That knows nothing about it, hasn't seen it. But B-52s and KC-135s were purchased for that one purpose, to cross the globe and drop nukes on the bad guys.
When I was little, we lived probably, I'd say 5 miles from Shepherd. I could get up on top of the roof. I had a tree out in front of the house that I'd climb up and get up on top of the roof. And I still remember they apparently would fire the engines up on a regular basis.
Oh, yeah.
Out there. And I could get up on top of the roof and I could see the top of the vertical empennage on these aircraft as they were sitting out there on the runway on the north side of Shepherd. You could see those things from the roof of the house.
Sure, they were on alert. They're on nuclear alert out there. Yeah.
And I guess that, those are probably the tall towers.
Tall tales.
Tall tales.
I don't know. I think they did.
This would have been about 1960. 4, 5, somewhere in there.
Could have been any model, but I do think they were D models here. I think that goes way back. Yeah, because they haven't had those here in many years now.
Every certain number of hours, we would hear the engines fire up if the wind wasn't blowing. You could hear them, and they'd run the engines for 10 minutes, something like that. I don't remember, but there was a period of time where you could hear all of them fire up.
That was when you went on alert in my day. You went on for 7 days. Right? During your 7 days, you were all but guaranteed there was going to be at least one exercise to start the engines. The exercise might have you move the airplane. Mm-hmm. You would essentially do an aborted takeoff if that's what the message said to do. And that's as close as you get. We could have launched if we'd wanted to. That was what it proved. And so at least once a week you'd have those. Well, then if you moved them especially, it's going to take 2 hours to get everybody back and shut the engines down because you have to bring them back one at a time, shut down the engines, get a truck out there and back them back into position, pre-flight them again, get them all ready. Meanwhile, I can go get one other airplane, bring him across. It was 2 hours to get back inside if the thing was a moving exercise.
So if it was a moving exercise, the engines might be on for...
You might hear them run for 2 hours.
2 hours.
Yeah.
That must be what I remember hearing.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure it probably was, yeah. Because generally at least once a week you'd have one of those.
Right.
When the klaxon went off, what that meant to us was report to the aircraft as quickly as you can, start the engines, and decode a message. And until we decode the message, we didn't know if it was an exercise or not.
So you received the message in the airplane.
Right. Yep. And it would they would just read a code to you. As soon as we got an engine started, we'd get a generator online, we'd get a radio going, and usually we'd have one of the navigators call. And he would get on that radio and say, control say message. And what you'd hear back was something like For doorknob, message follows. Foxtrot, uniform, Charlie, and this might go on. It might be 30 letters, might be 6.
Right.
Okay? And that would decode to something, and then we'd know, okay, if this is an exercise or not, okay? And what kind of an exercise it was. But until you decoded, you didn't know. So we treated them all as real because for all we knew, they were real.
For all you knew, they might have been.
And it was ingrained into us that if we heard that horn, you drop whatever you're doing and you run to your truck if you're not in the alert facility, or you run to the airplane if you're on the facility, and respond right now. You know? If somebody yelled, and the classic was, you're in the BX and a little old lady in tennis shoes comes running down the aisle and yells klaxon 3 times. Klaxon, klaxon, klaxon. You respond as if you heard the klaxon. Because maybe there's been a failure in the klaxon. And then they grab the little old lady and say, go in there and start yelling klaxon. How do you know? You don't know what's going on. So
wow.
It was always spring-loaded to go. Mm-hmm. Because you had to get off the ground in minutes if this was real. Because the submarine-launched ballistic missiles especially had a very short flight time. That's why in the Dakotas they built those bomber bases, because they're as far as possible from saltwater.
Way as far as you can get from. So it bought you more time get the airplanes off the ground and thus have a survivable response.
Right. Yeah. When I was stationed in Arkansas, we were much closer to saltwater in the name of the Gulf of Mexico. And if a Russian submarine crossed a certain line of longitude, heading west, well, then they would restrict us to the facility. And if it crossed another line, they would put starting cartridges in all 8 engines. Because on alert, you'd start these things with a starter cartridge, you call it. What it was a howitzer shell that had been cut down and had slow-burning powder in it. And there was a breach in each of the engines, and the crew chief would load these usually into just 2 engines. But if the submarine got too close, he'd load it in all 8. And with that, the co-pilot could throw a switch, and whatever engines had cartridges in them, that slow-burning powder would spin the engine and essentially act like a starter motor would.
Right. Is that how they were started always?
No. You only
there
did
were
that.
starter motors on them.
There were.
Right.
But
this worked faster.
This worked faster, but it's real hard on the engines. So you generally only did it on alert.
Dirt and all the other.
Right. Yeah, I had that very dirty. And
combustion.
At a certain statistical rate, they would explode instead of burn slowly, too. So
that would be detrimental to the
that was ugly when that happened. Yeah.
Hey, so if this is happening multiple times during an alert, in your mind, is it when a thing goes off, is it always a, oh shit, pit of your stomach, this is it? Or is it like, God damn it, I got to go do this thing now?
It was a combination of both. And it kind of depended on the timing, I got woke up, and I think I've told Rip this story. Got woke up by the klaxon why I remember it's a Sunday morning, I don't know, because alert was just alert. You lost track of days of the week, didn't matter. Mm-hmm. But I, for some reason, remember it was Sunday morning, and it had been snowing. This is in North Dakota. It had been snowing all night, but the temperature was like 33 degrees. And so there was a foot of slush on the ground. And I remember we lived in little buildings right behind the airplanes. And I remember coming out of that building and stepping in the slush, and my first thought was, damn, an exercise Sunday morning at 5 o'clock, come on. But, you do what you've been trained to do, and the pilots start the engines, the navigators decode the message, and they came up and they said, pilot, it decode, and I don't remember the numbers anymore. We would always talk about them in numbers. It's a message 19. I'm making that up. Well, that whatever that was, it decoded to taxi to the hold line and await launch. I remember seeing that in the code book. And so we said, you mean the exercise version of that? And they said, no, the real one. So we had the electronic countermeasures officer, you decode it. And he said, I already have. And it's a real world, go to the hold line. So I remember taxiing up there in that pre-dawn darkness and looking out that runway. And I could see a snowplow out there vainly trying to keep the center line clear, And I thought, crap, if they launch us, we're going to be the snowplow. Because our book said you couldn't even attempt takeoff unless more than, I think it was 0.4 inches of slush, less than half an inch. And we had a foot of it out there. So if this comes to a real-world launch, the second guy's going to find out if we blew enough of that off the runway, I guess. Because we're going to be a smoking hole at the end of the runway. But that was Cold War SAC, man. It was a grim place in that sense. They were at war all the time, and you had to take that all very seriously. I was reminded of that as a young co-pilot. In those days, in Strategic Air Command, you could not wear a flight suit unless you're on alert or flying. Okay? Instead, you had to be in the uniform of the day. And so what this meant was everybody had a closet full of uniforms because they all had to be professionally pressed and starched. And, you wear it one day, can't wear it again until it goes to the cleaners. And I was griping about that one time because I hadn't learned yet that a co-pilot should just keep his mouth shut. And the squadron operations officer, who's the number 2 guy in charge of the squadron, he heard me. And so a couple minutes later, I'm standing at attention in front of his desk. And he's explaining to me, he says, the nuclear deterrence consists of the American people and leadership and the Soviet leadership having the belief that if you're ordered to annihilate millions of human beings, you will carry the order out. If they don't think you carry the order out, there is no deterrence. And why would they think that if you won't do the little stuff like wear the clothes we tell you to wear, Lieutenant? So shut the hell up. Until it was one of those things. And of course,
hard to argue with the logic.
That's exactly, it occurred to me. It was a light bulb moment. That's exactly why we were the way we were in that command.
Right.
Exactly that. So that the Russians believed we were disciplined enough.
So you were credible.
Right, exactly.
Just credibility.
And everybody, I think everybody had to have their come to Jesus moment in SAC,
right,
where somebody set them straight about why things are the way they are here.
Right.
And I've heard, I don't know how many other people getting similar talks.
Let's go ahead and talk about SAC since we're headed in this direction. We want to talk about what it was like to fly a long mission, but let's go ahead. SAC is such an interesting organization that it really, nothing in the contemporary military parallels.
Oh, no.
SAC.
It's the single most powerful military organization in human history, easily. 2/3 of the human race is nuclear weapons under one commander. That's never going to happen again.
No.
It was. They had a blank check from Congress, pretty much, because what could be more important than nuclear deterrence?
Nothing.
Nothing.
At this time, nothing.
Yeah, nothing. So they got pretty much what they wanted from the unlimited money to spend. Extremely disciplined for that reason we just discussed. People outside the command generally dreaded getting an assignment to the command because of that.
Really?
Because they didn't. The rest of the
Nobody wanted to be in SAC.
I wouldn't say I did, but I mean nobody who was already serving outside SAC wanted to transfer
into SAC.
No, and
because
sometimes
it was a level of craziness that was just.
I blame the discipline. It was a level of discipline.
Right.
But, and every now and again, somebody would get in trouble because of that. They would bring a value in another command to this command and find out the hard way that that's not how it's done here.
Right.
Like reporting in a military manner to any superior. You didn't just walk in and say, hi, you wanted to see me. You always reported in a very formal manner, saluted from the position of attention. And,
regular Army kind of protocol.
And the rest of the Air Force didn't do that. I remember when I was chief of training flight for a while, the squadron commander he wanted me to be in his office when any new pilot came in. He says, you got to collect his flight records anyway, and so then you can give him the tour of the squadron. So I got this guy in, I can't remember exactly where he came from anymore, but in the interview with the squadron commander, he mentions that he's bought a house in Memphis, which was a little over an hour away from where we were. And the squadron commander says, well, what do you mean you bought it? Has money changed hands? And he says, yeah, my family's moving in right now. And the squadron commander says, well, I hope they like living there. You're not going to live there. What? That's too far away. One of the squadron commanders...
He didn't know?
No. Wow. One of the squadron commander's responsibilities is he had to have a certain percentage of his crew force
available
in place in a flight suit with mobility gear within X time, okay?
Right.
And he was personally responsible for that. And if you didn't meet your responsibilities in SAC and you're a commander, you were going to get fired. And it was usually in a really public way, so that everybody got the message.
Right.
The first operational readiness inspection I took part in, we failed. And on the stage at the base theater, they fired the wing commander, the vice commander, and the operations group commander is what we call them now. And the 3 ranking colonels were all fired in front of us, and the new ones were appointed. And those guys
right then,
at that moment, and those colonels, their families were out of their houses by the end of the week. It was brutal. And I remember sitting there as a first lieutenant going, I get it. This is not okay. Nobody says thanks for trying. Here's a participation trophy.
Right.
Failing that inspection meant that had the Russians started the war, this wing would not have done its part.
This wing would not be operational in that.
And how can that ever be okay?
Right. No, that's
a pretty demanding place.
One of my favorite stories is where the girl infiltrated the base. This is and the aftermath of that. This is real interesting. Everybody pay attention now.
The bravest people in the Cold War worked for what SAC called the Wing Security Evaluation, WSE. These guys, their job was to go unannounced to SAC bases. Nobody at the base was told that this is a test or anything. And they would try to get into the command post, the weapons storage area, the alert facility. They'd see if they could get in past the security.
In other words, SAC is testing itself constantly.
And you got to understand the guards guarding these places have a round in the chamber. And I've been told they'll never get out of prison again if something bad happens on their shift. So the people trying to break in under these circumstances are the bravest people I've ever.
Because they could easily have been shot.
Oh, absolutely, easily have been. Well, the way the story I got, of course, I wasn't there firsthand, but they showed up at Grand Forks. Like I say, always unannounced. The wing commander wasn't told, anything like that. And they sat in the parking lot of the weapons storage area, and that's the place where they stored and maintained the nukes. And they waited during shift change, and they read some airman's name tag off his fatigues. And after the shift change was done, one of the team members was an attractive young lady, and she bounced up to the entry point with a lunchbox and said, my husband is Airman Schmuck, and he forgot his lunch. Can you get this to him? And the guard evidently said, sure, whatever you want. And they sent the lunch back in there. And finally somebody says, hey, Schmuck, your wife brought the lunch. And he said, wife? What are you talking about? So, again, nobody's been told there's an exercise or anything.
Oops.
So the explosive ordnance disposal people respond, right, which is because they have to suspect it's something. And they got it out. Every SAC base had a place to deal with explosive ordnance. And they got it out there, and they x-rayed it, and it looked empty. And the way I was told the story, and they finally opened the thing up, there was a laminated card in there that says you failed the security evaluation.
Shit is right.
The full colonel in charge of security for the base was fired immediately. All of his deputies,
within an hour.
Oh,
right?
Yes, absolutely, right now. All of his deputies were fired. All the squadron commanders were fired, and every guard up there was decertified from guarding nuclear weapons. They had to fly people in from other bases and retrain everybody.
Wow.
It was amazing. I'd never seen anything like it. And a lot of those details I got second and third hand about how they got away. But I do know.
But you know enough to know that probably is exactly what happened.
I know they failed. I know they failed, especially. And then we were told that it was because this team had successfully gotten an unknown object into the weapons storage area.
Oh, God.
So, yeah, that was ugly. They're always evaluating us, you know. They're always trying to see if they get you to say something, do something.
And they would tolerate no deviation from protocol.
No, not when it deals with nukes and classified. There was no margin for error. No thanks for trying.
Right. Nick and I went out to Washington a couple of years ago. Has that been 2 years ago?
I think so, yeah.
And got to go aboard a nuclear sub out there, and there were several layers of security before we were allowed on board the thing. And when we were on board, there were areas that we could not approach, and
I'm sure. I've never been on one, but I
they didn't want us asking about it and stuff. It was a fascinating day. It really was.
Oh, I bet.
It was absolutely amazing. But the level of security around nuclear devices and stuff, they just do not tolerate the slightest bit of slop.
No.
It's
not just security, yes, but it's maintenance of this stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
When you were pulling nuclear alert in a bomber, your crew was on alert when the crew commander signed for the weapons. There's a receipt, and when I signed that thing, then my crew is now on alert. The other crew can go home. So my navigators were pre-flighting the weapons because we were supposed to assume alert. And one of the navigators came and got me and says, "You need to see this." So I climbed up in the bomb bay and I wormed my way up in between these short-range attack missiles, which are nuclear-tipped rockets we carried. And up on the top one, there was a drop of hydraulic fluid, about a half-inch diameter. That's it. Stop everything. I'm not signing for these weapons. And you could see where the drip came from, but that doesn't matter. Anything tied to nukes had to be perfect all the time.
Right.
Any discrepancy was not tolerated.
So you didn't take authority over over the payload.
No, because it wasn't right. Yeah,
it wasn't
there's a discrepancy.
As it was supposed to be.
Yeah. So I folded my arms, and nobody's surprised at this. The off-going crew,
they knew what you were going to do. That's why they came and got you.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So they weren't mad at us or anything. This is the way it is.
Right.
So my memory is we didn't go on alert till after dark that night because if I remember right, they had to swap the whole airplane out to work on that.
Really?
Yeah, and it's a huge deal to load up another whole airplane with nukes, and that's a monstrous task.
They couldn't just effect a repair right there.
No, I don't think they could. I think they had to get that launcher that had 8 missiles on it, and I think they had to get that out. Well, if that's going to come out, you're not going to be
it was hydraulic, and that's what was leaking.
Yeah, it was a rotary launcher, and it was a hydraulic powered.
Right.
So that was something to do with the drive for that thing is what was leaking. Yeah.
So they couldn't just repair it. They would have to repair and then certify the repair, and that's more than you can do standing there in the airplane.
Right.
Right.
So they had to bring another whole airplane out. Then I signed for that airplane's weapons, and then I was on alert.
Right.
And then the maintenance took the other one away, The alert force had absolute priority for all maintenance, everything. Right. They would drop everything. They'd cancel flights if they had to fix. The alert force had to be in perfect condition all the time.
So tell us about the Strategic Air Command. This is a fascinating organization. We're talking about their procedures and stuff, but what was the Strategic Air Command, and who was Curtis LeMay?
Curtis LeMay was actually the second commander-in-chief of the Strategic Air Command.
He was second.
And I don't remember the name of the first guy. But we called that job SINCSAC, Commander-in-Chief Strategic Air Command. And Kurt LeMay, although he was the second one, he was the one that created the SAC that I lived in and that you've read about.
Right.
He was, all his career, he was known as a hard disciplinarian. He fully understood the application of violence in pursuit of national objectives. He was the one that engineered the burning down of Japanese cities during World War II. It was he was responsible for that.
He was probably a colonel at the time.
Oh, no, he was a 3-star
He was by that time a general.
Oh, yes, yeah.
In world,
I think it was 7th Air Force is what his command, if I remember right. And he's the one that was in command of all the forces that were busy bombing Japan. He was
legendary.
Which
killed far more people than both nuclear devices combined.
Yeah, I think one night in Tokyo they killed more than both Hiroshima and Nagasaki did. I think, and of course those numbers, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki numbers, are very nebulous because everybody counts them differently. There's those where there's still casualties.
Right. Everybody who's 92 that died last week that was there.
Right. Might be counted as one. Right. So nobody knows exactly what the number is killed in the immediate explosion.
Right.
But we killed more in Tokyo.
With conventional weapons.
Yeah, it was a mixture of conventional weapons and incendiaries. One of the things LeMay's people had figured out the mixture of that. And those Japanese cities, made out of paper and wood largely at the time, it would create a self-sustaining fire tornado that would just move through the town. It would power by itself. And it would just suck all the oxygen out, burn everything in its path. It was
terribly destructive. So LeMay was no shirker.
He was legendary.
From pursuit of duty. And
not at all.
If there's not a doubt in your mind that Curtis LeMay would, in fact, have been capable of destroying all life in the Northern Hemisphere.
No doubt
on the Asian continent.
No doubt in my mind. He was one of the greatest air leaders ever in history. And there's 1,000 stories about him, about his level of discipline. And one of my favorites was the first KC-135. And they flew it to Offutt Air Force Base for him to inspect. And he's boarding the airplane with his always present cigar. And somebody on the tanker crew said, "General, you can't smoke in this airplane." And he says, "Why the hell not?" "Well, it's full of fuel. It might explode." And he took the cigar and he looked around and he said, "It wouldn't dare." He was once asked by a reporter.
It wouldn't dare.
There was a reporter waiting to interview him one time, and the reporter watched a parade of colonels and generals going in and out of his office, and he could hear shouting going on in the office. And this reporter asked the secretary, "Does the general have an ulcer?" And the secretary says, "No, but he's a carrier."
He's a passive character.
He was notoriously difficult to work for, from what I understand, because he was very demanding and he did no excuses.
Right.
And that he created that atmosphere at SAC, the no excuses atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
You know, anytime we were practice bombing and if my crew dropped a bad bomb, missed a target, that had to be explained. That's not okay. I'm going to be standing in front of somebody the next day, explaining this is what happened. You know, the first time
you'd better know.
Oh yeah, the first time this happened when I was a crew commander, I began to explain the malfunctions my navigators had, because the navigators aimed the bombs. We just drove the bus.
Right.
And I began to list the malfunctions, and the lieutenant colonel I'm talking to interrupts me and he says, "Captain, you're not here so I can hear your damn excuses. You're here to tell me why it's never going to happen again." Yes, sir. You know, it was that the whole command was like that. It was
Right.
very success oriented, and
Right.
like I've said several times, very disciplined. I had to explain to a new pilot that came from outside the command one time that we were never in the squadron building in civilian clothes. Because
Really?
yeah, he had reported in civilian clothes. We never come to this building in civilian clothes. You know, we just don't. This is the bomb squadron.
You are not a civilian in here.
Right.
Right.
So if we're coming in the weekends to mop floors or whatever, because we never had contractors to do that, you come in fatigues, but you don't come in civilian clothes.
Right.
There was constant reminders about throughout the command. It was LeMay that created that atmosphere, and he was right in doing so. It
Right.
had to be that way.
I guess it was not procedurally necessary, but it created the atmosphere that fostered a high level of accuracy, precision, competence, adherence to the protocol, that sort of thing.
And like I was lectured, that was deterrence. Deterrence is a mental state
Right.
of the Soviet leadership.
Right.
We
cannot fuck with these guys.
Yeah, we won't like how it ends if we do.
Right.
They had to be reminded of that all the time.
Right.
And it was LeMay that understood that.
Right.
You know, it's all about the potential for violence.
So where did SAC fit into the military hierarchy at the time? They were a division of the Air Force?
Yes.
Or were they?
Yeah, they were what the Air Force in those days called a major command. Okay? There was 4 major commands that I can remember. There was the Air Training Command, self-described.
Shepherds.
Right. Strategic Air Command, Tactical Air Command, that was fighters, and Military Airlift Command, that's airlift.
Logistics.
Right. Those are the major flying commands.
Right.
There were other commands, but those are the flying commands. And SAC was bombers and tankers.
Right.
During my time, they were the sole tanker manager. They owned all the tankers in the U.S. Air Force.
Really? So all refueling was done through SAC?
Yes, they had
Aerial
operational
refueling.
control of all the tankers. Tankers is what sets the U.S. Air Force apart from everybody else. The ability, the almost 100% universal capability to refuel our airplanes.
You know, that's a fascinating development. When you and I have discussed tanker refueling many times, when was that developed? When was the technology to aerially refuel an aircraft developed?
The very first ones were done in the 1930s, and LeMay was involved in one of those.
Wow.
When he was a captain or something. And it was just, they dropped the hose from one airplane to another and moved some fuel through it. It was just a, can we do it kind of thing.
Wow.
But
so somebody grabbed the end of the hose
Yeah.
and hooked it onto the tank.
Yeah, there's photos of that out there too. You'll find here.
And they just gravity fed fuel down the hose.
It was a concept,
Right.
could it be done kind
Yes.
of concept.
Right.
But purpose-designed tankers. The KC-135 was the first designed from the ground up. Well, it was a Boeing 707. But it was the first one that the U.S. Air Force went out and said, we want an airplane specifically to refuel other airplanes. It had a predecessor in the KC-97, which was a 4-propeller, 2-jet, later modification for B-29, actually.
Right.
But that was always seen as kind of an interim until we get a full jet tanker. So the KC-135, which is still out there, that's one of those airplanes like the B-52 that the taxpayers have gotten every penny out of those things.
Right.
They're still out there, and they're going to be out there.
And that was designed in the 50s as well.
Yep, yeah, about the same time as the B-52. They were seen as partners in the
Right.
acquisition process. They were both bought for one thing, and that was nuclear war.
Right.
The tankers, on the big nuclear mission, if we'd have gone, we were going to take off, and shortly after within probably 2 hours, we're going to meet a tanker. And he's going to give us what he's supposed to give us to make the targets. If we needed more than that, there was a word we could pass to him, a code word, that would require him to give us all his fuel. All of it.
And you had the capacity on the aircraft for all of that fuel?
It depends on what's going on. You know, I mean,
Right.
Under the way the mission was planned, we did not. But maybe there's been problems. You know, maybe we've had to stay at a lower altitude longer than we thought we were going to, and we burned more fuel than we thought we were going to. If that scenario came along, we could tell the tanker give us all his fuel. And in the standpipes in his tanks, he had about, I think, you have to ask a tanker guy, but they had 4 or 5 minutes of flight time after all the fuel they could pass us was gone. So the engines would run another 4 or 5 minutes or something like that. And they were supposed to use that to turn out of our way.
And then crash the airplane.
Yeah. Not survivable. Yeah. You cannot bail out of a KC-135. They even stopped carrying parachutes in them finally. The crews used to laugh at the idea that they had parachutes in there.
Because there's just not a way to.
There's not a way to get
Not
out.
a way to get out.
Right.
Oh God Almighty!
So those guys, the tankers are terrible.
So when they got that word from you, they were on a suicide mission.
Yep.
How many? That didn't really ever occur, did it?
Nope. That was only.
But that was in the protocol.
Right. That was in the books for the big nuclear war. Yeah. We called the SIOP, the Single Integrated Operating Plan. That was the big nuclear war plan, the SIOP, and it was in this. It was a page in the SIOP, if necessary. The U.S. doesn't plan kamikaze sorties. Right.
Right.
Our nuclear attack sorties were survivable sorties, at least on paper. You know, we weren't required to deliberately run ourselves out of fuel or something like that.
Right.
But if you could reach, I think the rule, if I remember right, was if you could reach your first target and safe escape beyond, then you were probably going to go. So it's not, you don't have to blow yourself up with the weapons, but you might have to go on one that you know you're not going to come back from, but only under the SIOP.
Right.
You know, like I said,
There's never a training scenario under which this is.
The U.S. does not do kamikaze.
Right. So the aerial refueling, that is such an interesting scenario. I guess you've got to be at a certain altitude in clear air. You don't?
No. I can't tell you the times I refueled in the weather at night.
IFR refueling.
Oh, yes. You need the
Please
fuel.
explain this to us.
You find the tanker with radar. Right? That was a mutual process between the tanker and the receiver.
Right.
And
See, I'm sitting here without any IFR experience, and I just can't imagine not being able to see what the hell you're going to connect your airplane to.
Well, you would eventually. Okay.
Right.
When you got a few hundred feet behind him, almost no matter what the weather, you could see him. You could see there he was.
You can see his the boom, I guess.
Yeah, you see his profile. Yeah, you can see. Okay, I can see 4 engines, and we also had infrared on the B-52 infrared cameras that were steerable, and we'd use them to help locate the hot spots of his engine and stuff in the weather. But many times I've refueled where there's no outside references. Just the only thing we can see is the tanker. Can't see the ground. Can't see the sky. You just see the tanker. And those are terribly disorienting. As soon as you got plugged in, you felt like he was doing barrel rolls or something. It's all just spatial disorientation.
Really? Yeah. What causes the spatial disorientation? The cloud movement?
Yeah, just the lack of visual references that make any sense.
Lack of a stationary reference.
Yeah,
right.
And you can't even look at your attitude indicator that you normally fly instruments by. You can't look at that. You can only look at the tanker because you're flying formation with the tanker is what you're doing.
Right.
So just looking up into that void with no other horizon or anything, it just messes with your senses. And you start to feel like he's turning and rolling.
All this kind of, and you actually physically perceive that,
yeah,
really.
And you just have to fight that off.
Right.
You just have to just ignore it as much as you can.
Oh, God.
And it's not an easy task.
How long does it take to refuel, to take on whatever load you're going to?
Well, that obviously varies with the load.
Right.
A lot, okay.
But typically,
on training sorties, we never needed the fuel. We needed the practice.
Right.
And so they'd only pump us usually about 10,000 pounds, which only took a few minutes. But for instance, the Desert Storm sorties, my unit was deployed to RAF Fairford, and they flew their combat missions from there and back every night. Mm-hmm. Those required 1 tanker pre-strike and 2 tankers post-strike. So from each of those, they would get 125,000 pounds, something like that, if memory serves.
And how long would that
That'd take 45 minutes to an hour.
hooked up to the airplane?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
An hour hooked up to the
My first check ride in the left seat as a crew commander, to pass the check ride, I had to have 45 minutes of continuous contact time, we call it, with the boom plugged in. I could have 2 inadvertent disconnects during that time, but if I had a third one, you fail. So you had to practice staying under for a long time because it just took a long time. The tanker could pass the fuel faster than we could take it.
Right.
So he had to run his
He had
pumps
an enormous pump, I guess. I
don't know anything about their systems really, but yeah, it was capable of passing fuel faster. And if he turned his pumps all on to us, it would back pressure the refueling manifold that's feeding our tanks,
Right.
and it would pop the boom off if that happened. Wouldn't break anything, but you couldn't stay in contact.
It was designed to have
there's a
contact
safety,
broken. Little rubber nipple or something like that.
Yeah, there was
designed to,
on the bomber. There was toggles that would grab the end of the boom like this,
Right.
and they were capable of being overridden, kind of like a roller delay on a rifle.
Right. It would
Force would pop them off.
Right.
Without
Sufficient force
damage.
would cause them to release without breaking.
Without doing damage.
Right.
Yeah. And that was if for some reason the electronics failed and we couldn't disconnect manually, that was the last option was what we call a brute force disconnect. You just
jerk the thing out of there.
Yeah. They specifically avoid the use of jerk. They just reduce power and
It should
allow
have been
yourself to kind of fall off the back.
Gradually build up the force. Right.
Yeah, there was early in the air refueling world, there was lots and lots of mishaps. And
Oh, God almighty. Can you
these-
imagine the number of times?
at the bomber schoolhouse, there was a hallway that had nothing but photos of refueling mishap airplanes, and some of them were just, how do you even do that? There was one where the refueling boom from a tanker was stuck through the engine pods and broke off, and the bomber took the refueling pod home with him, stuck to the the engine pod like an arrow. How do you even get that far off?
I don't know. That's well, I could figure out a way to do it, but I mean, it sounds to a civilian like such an incredibly complicated thing. You're both flying along at 400 miles an hour,
Yep.
and you are going to put the refueling boom into a nipple on the top of your airplane and keep it there at a fixed distance at 400 miles an hour for 45 minutes without fucking anything up. It
was
amazing.
As a receiver, we would just fly formation on the tanker, the airplane. The
Right.
boom operator tanker is his job to fly that boom into our refueling
So he had
receptacle.
aerodynamic
Right, he had
surfaces
little
on the...
V-shaped wings up there, and he
Right.
would literally fly that thing into the receptacle,
Right.
which was
So
10 or 12
he's
feet
just
behind
as
us.
responsible for this as you guys are.
Yeah, all we can do is get in position, and he's the
one that stabs the...
exactly. Yeah.
Right, okay.
I've had those guys wrap that thing off my windscreen a couple times. That scared the crap out of you.
Oh, God almighty.
But every bomber, if you get up on the top and look, you'll see all kinds of marks where the boomer's missed at some time in the past. Because it's not an easy task.
Gouges.
We had to keep our receptacle in a 4-foot cube. That was the limits. If we got outside that, it would disconnect. The electrical signal would disconnect us. And then, as an instructor, you had to be able to fly out at all those limits. You had to be able to become stabilized at the left limit, the right limit, the upper limit, the inner and the out limits.
Right.
That's refueling squared. I mean, it's twice as hard as just refueling.
Right. Oh, God. Well, so if you're going to fly a training mission, and you were actually in combat in the Persian Gulf, but I would imagine there were instances during which you would take off from North Dakota and fly somewhere a long way off, do some shit, and come back. And what was the longest mission you ever flew?
Mine was 41 hours. It was the longest.
You sat in the seat.
No. We had
41
3
hours.
pilots. So we rotated left seat, right seat, out of the seat.
And how long? What was the longest period of time you were in a seat?
About 8 hours on that sortie.
Right.
But I've flown, I don't know how many training sorties where I was in the seat for 12 hours, maybe 13. Training sorties, it wasn't unusual for training sorties to be 12 hours long. I've seen both the Atlantic and the Pacific on the same
On
flight.
the same day.
Oh, a number of times, yeah. Because we could. That's what the B-52 has. It has range and payload.
Right.
So our schedulers thought nothing of scheduling a refueling off the California coast and a low-level bomb attack in New York State. That's what worked out. Because we could. It was that simple.
Right. So you got to be able to.
It was an endurance. Flying a B-52 was an endurance thing. Yeah. You had to be able to pace yourself. And it's very heavy on the controls. It takes muscle power to fly the thing around. And then at the end of virtually every training sortie, you would spend 2 hours doing touch and goes, because it took 2 hours to get 2 pilots recurrent, and you had to each of the guys had to have a precision approach, a non-precision approach, a touch and go, a low approach, a no flap approach, and this just takes time
to accumulate all these experiences.
And you never ever passed up a chance to reset what pilots call currency. We had a whole list of events, and you had to refuel once every 60 days. You had to take off once every 30 days, whatever. And those are currency items. Mm-hmm. And if you never pass an opportunity to update your currency, because you didn't know going non-current was your problem.
So at the end of the training mission, you guys would decide who's going to do the following currency items, or was that planned into the flight
you would on the mission planning day, the day before, you'd look at all that stuff. Okay, what do we need?
Right.
And so you knew what you were going to do when you got back.
So it's all part of the part of the schedule.
So at the end of the day, the hardest work for the pilots comes along, really. So it's just exhausting.
Right. Oh, I'm sure.
So
here's an obvious question: if you're in the chair 12 hours, when do you pee?
When you get a chance, you can get out. There was a urinal on the lower deck. And you climb down a ladder down where the navigators were. And
right.
Behind them, there was a urinal, it looked like a coffee can that was 3 feet tall and had a spring-loaded lid on it, completely unusable by a female. You had to stand to use this. And it was underneath, I think it was underneath the water jug down there or something. Whatever it was, you had to get your hips forward and use it. It's pretty tough.
But you could get out of the chair.
You could get out of the seat, yeah. And
How often would you get up? Every couple of hours to stretch your legs? I mean, 12 hours in a seated position that's kind of difficult physically for a human to do.
Yeah, it is. I've done it. I mean, it depends on the profile of the mission. Sometimes there just wasn't hardly a chance.
Right.
I've gone a 12-hour mission and not got out at all. Just landed with a full bladder, and because the pace of the mission was such that there wasn't a chance.
Right.
And obviously one pilot had to be at the controls at all times. And so if you only had 2 pilots on board, you couldn't swap seats, because that meant that nobody would be at the controls for some amount of time.
Oh, yeah, I see this.
And generally, the co-pilot was qualified in the right seat, the pilot was qualified in the left seat, and an instructor was qualified in both seats.
Right.
That was one of the big things when I became an instructor, is I had to be ambidextrous on the controls. Because if you're in the pilot's seat, the yoke is in your left hand and the throttle's in your right. Mm-hmm. In your co-pilot's seat, the yoke is in your right hand.
Right.
So one of the things, when you got selected to upgrade from co-pilot to crew commander, one of the big things you had to do is start flying with your left hand. And planes aren't normally flown with the left hand. Military planes aren't.
Right.
Well, Piper Cherokees are, typically, because you sit in the left seat.
Right.
So the throttle will be in the middle. But military airplanes generally are flown with the stick in your right hand and the throttle's in your left.
Well, so on a big, long mission, you're over various types of terrain and water and everything, and you're at what altitude in a B-52?
Oh, it varied a lot. Cruising between activities.
Like if you're ferrying over to Southeast Asia.
Oh, you'd try to go as high as you could for practical.
For fuel
right.
purposes.
So
right.
39,000, 40,000 feet, it would be a typical number for that. And then low levels.
Just above commercial aircraft.
You try to stay away, in the 48 states, you try to stay away from the altitudes that they liked.
32.
They liked between 30 and 39, something like that.
So
we try to stay below or above that, and it's usually easier to be below that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The B-52 on paper had a 50,000-foot ceiling, but I had a G model to 48, I think. It just wouldn't go higher. I had an H model to 45, something like that. It
really?
just wouldn't go higher.
That's the highest you've ever been?
Yeah, it just wouldn't go anywhere. There's just not enough the air for the engines, and they would start
won't climb above that.
Right. They would start doing what we call a compressor stall, where as I know you know, but a jet engine is just a series of aerofoils that push the air back and compress it, and airfoils can stall aerodynamically, and so in an engine you call that a compressor stall. Mm-hmm. And when that happens, you stop producing useful thrust. It can destroy the engine, depends on the engine design. Some of those stalls aren't very hard, and they're just kind of an annoyance. Right. Sometimes they can cause physical damage to the engine.
But if you're experiencing those kind of failures, you drop down in altitude.
Yeah, because you don't want to damage the engines if you can avoid it. Obviously, that's a bad plan in an airplane.
Bad idea. So the highest you've ever flown was what?
I've been to 49,999 feet in a T-38.
Oh, in a T-38.
Yes.
And that's probably about the ceiling of a T-38.
The Air Force says at 50,000 feet you need to be in an astronaut suit.
Right.
Pressure suit.
So, and you, of course, never went above.
No.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I understand. So, when you're flying over 40,000 feet, you're over most weather, right?
Yeah. Except for maybe a big thunderstorm.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they can punch
go way
through,
up there,
but and you would obviously fly around those.
Oh, yeah.
Whenever, you don't want to be in the middle of that much turbulence.
No. When I taught aviation weather, I always told guys that God loves his thunderstorms. We know this because he makes 40,000 a day on this planet, and they're very well armed to deal with human beings who poke holes in them. In fact, the final report isn't in, and so I'm not giving away anything here, but we lost a T-6er just a few months ago, and that was...
Really? No, I didn't know that.
Oh, yes. It was thunderstorm related, I'm sure. Nobody's seen the final safety report, but yeah,
right.
I was very gratified. One of the guys in that had to eject out of that plane, I had given him an emergency training sortie in the simulator 2 days before where I made him eject. So I like to think.
Hopefully that helped. Right?
Yeah, I hope so.
Right.
Yeah. Those are 2 instructor pilots.
So if you're flying along at 40,000 feet, can you see down? Was your position in the cabin such that a forward glance will show you the ground, or are you above the horizon in a sense?
No, you could see the ground, but the nearest thing you could see was 15 or 20 miles away from you, probably.
Right.
Just because of the downward vision
Right.
angle. Like that.
Right.
And that varies a lot from airplane to airplane, of course. The
Right.
B-52 is particularly bad for visibility. Seeing out of it, even for the pilots, was difficult.
Because of the angle of
just
the
the nature.
wind
Yeah, it
streams.
didn't have a clear canopy. It had those windows.
Right.
And there's frames between the windows and stuff, and so it wasn't a high visibility airplane. And the F-16, by contrast, the pilot sits under a completely unbroken canopy. It's not broken by any framework
Total
or anything. Yeah.
360.
Yeah, it's a bubble canopy that has no seams or anything in it.
Right.
So he's got
Designed for looking around.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah. That's one of the F-16's best things when I talk to my friends who flew it, is the visibility out of it is spectacular.
Right.
You feel like you're sitting outside the airplane, they tell me.
Well, so for those of us that have never been at that altitude in charge of an airplane, what does it feel like flying along at 40,000 feet and the airspeed is in excess of 400 miles an hour?
Yeah, your ground speed might be in excess of 500.
Right.
Because the higher you go, the higher your true airspeed. The higher your true airspeed,
Right.
the higher your ground speed.
Right.
So
are you aware of movement?
there's very little sensation of speed, even supersonic. There's very little sensation of speed, unless you fly into a cloud or something like that.
So now suddenly you've got a reference outside.
Yeah. If you were to pierce a cloud, that sudden motion would tell you, "Wow, I'm going fast."
But in clear air, you can't really.
There's little sensation. You have to look at the ground for a minute to realize, oh, okay, it's moving.
Crawling along, but you're so high, it's not an apparent. I like to get window seats when I fly because I spend at least a third of the time looking out the window.
Oh yeah, when I fly, I do too.
It's fun. I'd just like to see the ground going by and look at the geomorphology and all the clouds and
all the
stuff.
stuff you can't
crap
see
I
from the ground.
Right.
Yeah.
Everything you can't see from the ground fascinates me.
Yeah, one of the most spectacular things I ever saw in an airplane is we're up north, headed north in a B-52, middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, and we flew underneath the Northern Lights. That was really something. I have this distinct memory of looking straight up. We had a window in the ejection hatch straight above our heads, and I remember looking up through that thing and seeing them come down at me like, and spread out.
Right.
Instead of the curtain that you get on the ground, it was looked like a starburst above. Right. It was just spectacular.
Oh God!
It's one of the things that pilots like about flying. It's just stuff that you look at.
Yeah, so many fascinating, different perspectives than a ground-bound person.
Oh yeah, it's one of the reasons it's such an addicting thing.
Oh yeah.
Military pilots will all tell you universally that they have the best job the human race ever came up with. There's just never. I feel very fortunate that during my time as a crew commander, as an instructor pilot, that I knew I was having the most fun I'm ever going to have in my whole life. It's never going to be better.
Never going to get better than this.
Yeah. And it's fun to know it at the time.
Right.
And not have to look back and go, gee, I wish I would have appreciated it.
Right.
But I think every military pilot tells you, they appreciate it at the time. They know they've got the best job ever.
How many different aircraft have you flown?
Do
you remember?
It's not that many. I learned to fly in a Piper Cherokee.
That was when
I was still in college, yeah.
Oh, before you went.
Right, I got a private pilot's license out of it. The Air Force paid for that since I was a pilot candidate cadet. They paid for that.
Right.
I had to pay for the license exam. They paid for the flying hours.
Right.
See, at pilot training, then you had to get qualified in a T-37 to solo in it, and then you had to get qualified in a T-38 to solo in it, and then went to the B-52, and I had been a co-pilot in the B-52 for a very short time when they flew in a half a dozen T-38s up to Grand Forks and said, go over and fly those to all co-pilots, bomber and tanker co-pilots. They said, go over and fly those planes. So they had instructor pilots over there from the Air Training Command. And I think the third time I flew it, when we went in, he said, well, that was your check ride. You're now qualified in T-38 again. Okay, what are we supposed to do with it? And the guy from Air Training Command said, we don't know. We were just told to check you guys out. So we went to our hierarchy and said, what are we supposed to do with them? And they said, you're supposed to fly them. And do what?
Do what with them?
We don't know. There's no rules yet. Mm-hmm. So for the next year and a half, we had the best license to steal that any military pilot's ever had. Go fly a supersonic, fully acrobatic jet with essentially no rules. Just don't crash. Don't land gear up.
Fly the damn thing around.
Log some hours. Yeah.
Wow.
So we said, well, can we take them cross country? Can we go stay overnight some other place? Sure.
Can you imagine?
So, it's fun.
What a cool deal.
And here we're all
everybody dreams of being able to do that.
And we're all in our mid-20s. And I had my first divorce right after those planes showed up. So I'm single again. And, you get to call up some girl that you knew in college. And, hey, my buddy and I are going to come down there, and we're not going to have any wheels. So how about you get another girl and come get us?
Come pick us up.
You'll know us because we got the flying helmet under one arm. We're wearing a G suit and, skin-tight clothes. You'll recognize it. It's great. It's never going to happen again.
No. That's an experience.
And we learned things doing that. The idea was just to give co-pilots experience in anything. All flying time is valuable. Right. And you're always a student in an airplane.
The more things you experience in the more different circumstances, that just builds this deep base.
And you can't imagine two airplanes more opposite than a B-52 and a T-38 in every possible way.
Yeah.
Completely opposite airplanes. So it was a very good experience. And, we learned a lot just about flying in general. Got in trouble several times. And the lesson in a couple of those was sometimes it sucks to fly. Because we didn't do anything wrong. It just came out badly, and it wasn't our fault.
Not all of the variables are under your control.
That was a lesson that I had to slowly learn, that all military pilots have to slowly learn. When you're young and stupid, you do stupid things with the airplane, and if you survive, you start to learn that, maybe that wasn't the smartest thing I've ever done.
Right.
I know I had a friend that had a bird come through the windscreen, and he got in a lot of trouble because it turned out he was flying lower than he was supposed to. Now, he would try to say, well, what's that got to do with bird strikes? Guys have struck birds at 20,000 feet. And the safety board told him, don't change the subject. You weren't at 20,000 feet.
You weren't. We're not talking about the bird.
Yeah. But I remember watching that process and realizing a couple things. One is this was for my benefit, not his.
Right.
They're saying to the rest of us, watch what happens, okay, when you breach discipline in this command. And the other thing that occurred to me in big capital letters was, I don't care how good a pilot you are, and I'm the best, just ask me. I don't care how good a pilot you are, you're not in control of everything. No. You're not in control of the birds.
You know, it really is, just as off the topic, it is amazing to me that bird strikes are as either rare or as inconsequential as they could be. I mean, you put a goose through a jet engine.
Birds have killed hundreds of people.
Yes, I'm sure they have. It's on, how would they not have?
Yeah, they're...
Especially on propeller-driven aircraft.
Well, the good news about propeller-driven aircraft
landing and taking
is
off.
The prop protects the engine pretty well.
Does it?
Yeah.
Cuts the bird out.
Yeah.
Before it gets in there.
Tends to, yes.
Right.
I know they've had a couple of prop strikes with birds out here at Shepherd, and it didn't damage them.
With the T6.
Yeah.
So if a jet engine ingests a bird, what can it tolerate?
Depends on the engine, depends on the bird, a lot of variables. But sometimes T-37 engines, they tear them down for routine inspections and go, I wonder when it ate a bird.
Right.
Nothing happened.
So a dove could...
Sucked it up and chewed, spit it out,
Dove could go through there and
Might.
not tear a lot of stuff
On the other hand...
a duck might be a...
You throw a pencil in a T-38 engine, it's going to destroy the engine.
A pencil?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That thing can tolerate none of that. Right? Wow. It's just the design parameters are so tight in it that it can't take any of that. I had a compressor stall in a T-38 when I was a student that destroyed the engine. It made a lot of noise, scared the hell out of me, but I found out that at idle it seemed normal. It was giving me normal indications at idle. It was only later after I landed and they inspected the engine that they told me they threw the thing away, and it was a compressor stall that did it. And a part broke, a fan blade broke, and now it goes back breaking more blades.
Right. Cascade failure.
Right. So bird easily can break blades in engines.
Right.
And some engines are more tolerant, and there's just so many variables. Mm-hmm. They put what they call a bird-proof windscreen on the T-37 when I was flying it, and it was thicker plexiglass. And the standard joke was it was designed to take a 2-pound bird at 150 knots or a 150-pound bird at 2 knots. And the thing distorted your view through the windscreen. Something terrible. We hated those airplanes. Yeah. We'd rather take our chances. It really distorted the view.
Yeah.
Because it was so thick.
Sure it did. Well, so what was your favorite airplane to fly?
Oh, the B-52. Absolutely.
More than the T-38?
T-38 was a lot of fun. Don't get me wrong.
Now, Chuck Yeager has always said that his favorite aircraft was the T-38 to fly because it's just analog, seat of the pants, simple jet airplane.
It's a World War II airplane that's supersonic. That's what it is. Yeah. The A model was.
Right.
They've all been converted to C models now, and now they're modern jet fighters.
Right.
With all the digital controls and everything in them. The heads-up display and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The ones I flew when I was dual qualified in B-52s, T-38s, those are A models. So yeah, don't get me wrong, they were a lot of fun, but I like the B-52 because it had a mission and it did it well, and it's one of the most well-known airplanes in history. People that can't identify any other airplane can identify a B-52.
You see it from the air, from the ground, and know you're looking at a B-52. Yeah. There's nothing any more unmistakable than that profile.
And it's fun to know that the last thing any potential enemy wants to see is me and my 8 engines. He does not want to see that.
No, he does not.
It's fun to fly that airplane.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was for one point in my career, I primarily did non-nuclear contingency planning. And SAC you said it earlier, SAC had plans to kill every human being on the planet with nukes and with conventional weapons.
Right.
And it only made sense that
conventional weapons were part of their part of the game plan as well.
Oh, yes. And so in this job, SAC would tell us, here's the what if. What if Argentina invades Mexico? What will you target? What kind of weapons would you need to support? That kind of thing. And they'd just go back and forth between us and headquarters would finally approve it. And basically we'd roll it up and put it in a safe in case we need it someday. It was while I was in that job that they, in essence, called us up one day and said, dust off your Panama plan because we're going. So it only makes sense that they did this. This is all done as a precautionary. So the basic.
So you don't have to do
done
it right now in a hurry
from scratch
when you don't have time.
Somebody's already thought something about it.
Right.
Yeah. So that was what we did. And that was non-nuclear contingency planning.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I can't begin to tell you all the things we did. A lot of it, I'm sure, is still classified because just from a sensitivity standpoint.
Right.
Right.
We don't want to have. We don't want to have the contingency plan for bombing Jerusalem in public.
You don't say that stuff out loud.
No.
Right. And we were, during my day in the Cold War, we couldn't even fly into Canadian airspace without diplomatic permission in a B-52.
Oh, really?
Because it was just,
wasn't that the route to the Pacific, though?
Yeah, but you had to stay south of the Canadian border until you got to the feet wet.
Really?
Yeah. Now, once a year, there'd be a big exercise they called snow time, where we would get blanket permission to fly up about 80 degrees north, turn around, descend down on the deck, and try to penetrate NORAD's defenses. It was an annual exercise. So then they would give us blanket permission to do it. But on a routine basis, you could not.
Really?
The only country in the world besides the States that you can land in without any problem was England.
Oh, really?
Yeah. English have a long tradition of bird watching airplanes.
Mm-hmm.
During Desert Storm, there was hundreds of people at the end of the runway, all times, and they're out there recording in their logbooks the tail numbers and any nose art they see. And there's a whole society of this in England, so you're always welcome in England. And they have a whole different idea of air traffic control. It operates on the theory that it's a big sky and airplanes aren't that big, kind of much more loose than we do.
Right.
When I went over to pre-brief them for our plans for Desert Storm, and I expected it was going to be about a 2-hour meeting. I had an easel with displays on and stuff. And I talked for about 5 minutes, and the ranking guy says, these are going to be combat missions, right? Yes. Do whatever you want. Every day if a member of the royal family is airborne, we put out a notification that stay out of their airspace. Other than that, do whatever you want. They just didn't care what we did. They figured we'd take care of ourselves.
Right.
And surprisingly, the French did the same thing.
Oh, really?
They just said, as long as you stay above 20,000 feet, we'll do whatever you want. Yeah. So they were very cooperative during Desert Storm. And we kind of surprised us after the F-111 thing when we bombed Libya. And the French wouldn't let us fly over their airspace.
Right. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Led to a
that
great
got a lot of bad press here.
Yeah, but it led to a great Sam Kinison bit.
Oh, God bless him, Sam.
He was one of my heroes.
Oh, he was a great guy. He was a funny guy anyway.
And original.
You told me several times the smell.
Yeah.
Inside the cabin, inside the cockpit of the B-52.
Everybody that gets in one for the first time will tell you it's a smell they've never smelled anywhere else. It's not a stink. Right? It's 50 years of flight lunches, puke, jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, urine. It just all of this combines to make the smell. That's a B-52 smell. It's not unpleasant. It's
just characteristic.
And it's very unique. You've never smelled it before.
Right.
I came to think of it. You know how we do with smells. They trigger things in us.
Yes,
right?
they do. And you smell them. You remember smells for long after you smell. They're probably the most persistent memories in your brain. I remember when I was probably 3. There was a rubber mattress that caught on fire in our garage. And to this day, if I smell that particular smell, I remember that from that time back in the 1950s. It's still in there. Yeah. Still embedded in my little brain.
Oh, yeah. See, I came to think of that buff smell, that B-52 smell, as a good thing. It's a pleasant, because when I would smell it, I was about to fly.
Right.
And I'd stick my head up the hatch after doing my walk around outside, and I'd stick my head up the hatch, and that smells a good thing.
You're home.
We're going to go.
You're home.
Yeah.
We're ready to work.
Yeah.
Right.
So maybe that's why I didn't think it stunk. But most people don't like hold their nose and go, "Oh my God, that's terrible." It's just different.
Right.
nothing quite like it. You know, you mentioned the urinal, or it was on the lower deck. If you took the defense instructor and kicked him out of his seat, and he sat right at the top of the ladder from between the decks. If you kicked him out of his seat and removed the seat cushions, you would eventually come to a toilet seat. Okay? And under there, if the crew chief remembered, there's a plastic bag hanging underneath it. And that was the facility.
Right.
So there was an unwritten rule that for sorties under 12 hours, put a cork in it. Because everybody's going to suffer if you use that.
Don't shit on this airplane unless it's absolutely necessary.
And I think it's one of the reasons why the B-52 was the very last airplane to get female crew members, because there was zero privacy.
No accommodation.
Yeah. And when you sat, if you had to sit and use that thing, your left shoulder was against the ejection seat for the electronic countermeasures operator. And if you reached out here, you could grab the gunner's left elbow. So this is how you're going to take a crap. You're going to
cramped quarters.
Yeah. Yeah. So they obviously made some accommodation now, because they've had all female crews a couple of times. So, but it was the last plane in the inventory to get female crew members, and I think that was a big part of it.
Well, if they're all female, it doesn't matter.
Right. That doesn't matter. Right. But yeah, it's a terribly uncomfortable airplane. Crew comfort's just not a consideration. That great big old airplane, the only place you can stand straight up is on that ladder.
The whole airplane.
Yeah. The whole pressurized compartment.
Not any headroom.
Now, when you got to the top of the ladder, you had to bend at the waist and walk that way up to the flight deck where the pilot seats were. And right at the top of the ladder, facing backwards, was the electronic countermeasures and the tail gunner's seat. So if you went forward, you eventually got to the flight deck from the pilot's room, but you couldn't stand up in that walkway. And then the temperature was never right. It was always too hot or too cold. The noise level was obscene.
I can imagine.
We had a flight doc measure the noise inside navigator's ear cups, inside the helmet, at 100 decibels.
Oh, my God.
So another common thing B-52 crew members have is hearing loss.
So do you communicate with the other crew members over the radio?
Interphone, yes. You have to use interphone.
You can't, there's no acoustic ability to communicate.
If I leaned over and if the co-pilot and I both took our helmets off, if I leaned over and yelled right in his ear from 2 inches, he could hear me. The noise level was
obviously, you've got to have some kind of internal comm system. So.
Right. Yeah. So I got to where I flew with earplugs inside the earphones to try to minimize the hearing damage, because it was just awful.
Oh God, I guess it is.
Yeah, we used to joke that the plane was obviously designed as a drone, and the crew was an afterthought, because it just seemed like they put no effort into crew comfort at all.
Right.
It's not a passenger airplane, so everybody in here's got duties to perform. So we don't really care about.
Were the seats ergonomic in any?
Yeah, they were. The seats were surprisingly comfortable, I thought. The ejection seats were. Now there was 4 other interphone and oxygen stations besides the ejection seats for instructors to sit in, or extra people to sit in. None of those were comfortable at all.
Right.
There's a cushion on top of something hard metal, But I thought the ejection seats were reasonable.
How many personnel could you actually get into a B-52?
You could get 11, if I remember, if you shared one of the oxygen interphone stations. But you could get 10 in there, and everybody would have an interphone and oxygen panel.
Was that normal?
At the schoolhouse when I was a co-pilot, that was very common. Because in those days, we trained as a crew at the schoolhouse. All 6 of you were undergoing training together. And when we finished the training, we all moved together and became a crew at the new base.
So it was more common for 6 people to be on the airplane.
Yeah, the normal basic crew was 6. And then if somebody, for instance, the
training considerations.
Yeah. The co-pilot went non-current. It hasn't made a landing in enough time, and his crew commander's not an instructor pilot. Well, now we got to bring an instructor pilot to watch this guy land, and say, okay, you can land again. So it was uncommon to not have at least one extra person on the airplane. It seemed like it was very kind of 7 or 8.
So 7 or 8 was more normal than 6.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
But
especially in peacetime. But in wartime, there would probably be 6 people on
6. When Desert Storm came, they came and said, hard cruise, fly combat, the 6 of you, that's it.
Right.
No extras on board.
Right.
So they made some exceptions, of course, later on, but that was the initial thing. So, yeah, I think you said towards the beginning of this that I flew combat, and I did not fly combat in Desert Storm.
Oh.
My unit did.
Your unit did, but you personally did not.
Now, that was during that time I was in that non-nuclear planning thing, I didn't have my own crew. So instead, I planned missions and briefed them,
Right.
debriefed them. So
Were you over there or were you in England?
I was in England, but our guys flew a round-trip mission. Every mission was all the way to Iraq and back. The shortest missions were 17 hours, and some of them were 24 hours. Wow. After the Iraqis got that lucky hit with a Scud missile, killed 10 or 12 Air Force people.
What did they hit with the Scud?
Hit a barracks, if I remember right.
Oh, it was a ground attack.
Yeah, it was a Scud missile, a ground-to-ground missile.
Right.
And it was basically unaimed, so it just got lucky.
Yeah, a Scud was basically a V2, wasn't it?
Yeah, basically, yeah. And they got lucky, and they killed a dozen or so. I think they hit a barracks. After that, we sometimes flew anti-Scud missions where they would load the plane up with those cluster bomb units,
right,
and they'd orbit over Saudi Arabia. And when the satellite would detect a Scud launch, they'd download the lat long to the bomber, and he'd go in there and just try to pay him back, show him it ain't free to launch one.
Right.
Those missions were 24 hours long because they're loitering.
Because they're orbiting.
Yeah.
Right.
It's another thing that
loitering.
The buff's been very useful in Afghanistan because of that. They can loiter for hours and hours and hours. And now, of course, they drop not all, but a lot of smart weapons and everything that I never fired. The unit I was in for most years, we were the conventional bombing specialists for the command. Mm-hmm. That's why we deployed for Desert Storm. No other unit deployed. They sent crews TDY to those locations. Right. We picked up and moved.
In other words, you relocated for the duration of the conflict.
About a third of our squadron went to the three other bases that were going to be operating B-52s in the Middle East. And then other wings sent people there, and then our guys helped get them all up to speed on the conventional bombing thing. This was a plan SAC had. There's guys up in Maine. They specialized in Harpoon anti-ship missiles. Everybody at all the other bases got the ground school in it. Those guys regularly, routinely practice with them. The idea being that now we can send crews up to augment them if a protracted thing happens. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty much how we did Desert Storms. Our unit was the conventional bombing bunch. And so they took about a third of our squadron, spread them out. And then it was actually 2 days after the air war started that we were told to deploy. When the air war started, I was in California delivering a B-52. Every B-52 is different from every other B-52. There's no two exactly alike. And so SAC
Why would that be? I guess because the repairs and
and they're large and complicated organisms. Just like no two people are exactly alike. We all have the same organs, but we're not exactly alike. It's the same thing. Plus stuff that when I first got into B-52s, we were just at the end of carrying a weapon called an AGM-28 Hound Dog. It's the original cruise missile.
Right.
By today's standards, grossly inaccurate thing. Essentially, we carried a little airplane under each wing. Right. Well, when those were decommissioned, right after I became a co-pilot, they capped off the fuel lines and electric lines, but they didn't remove all the wiring. They didn't remove all the plumbing. So
just didn't bother.
There's thousands of pounds of unused plumbing and wiring on every airplane. There's no way to calculate the center of gravity on it. Up at Tinker Air Force Base, they have one of the world's largest buildings up there where B-52s go to get big fixes done on them. And every time we would go there, they would literally hang the thing from the ceiling to find out what the center of gravity was. They'd update the center of gravity.
Because it couldn't be calculated.
Couldn't be calculated, no. Because each one's just different.
Right.
So as Desert Storm was approaching, SAC was shuffling airplanes around to get the airframes they wanted to the places they wanted them. And so I took a crew to California, to the schoolhouse base at Castle, and dropped the bomber off, and I don't know where it was going to go eventually. But I was in my hotel room that night when the radar navigator came running in and said, turn on the news, they've started. So I wasn't home when the air war started. And I was stunned when I landed at Memphis on the airliner to look at all the security there. Because, it just hadn't been like that before. And all of a sudden there's cops everywhere and you can't go anywhere and they're funneling everybody. It was just surprising to see all that.
Interesting. So when was the end of SAC? That had to have been after Berlin Wall.
I want to say 93.
So Berlin Wall was 89.
Right. It was after Desert Storm, which was 91.
Soviet Union was 90.
Right.
Right.
So
Desert Storm's 91, and SAC operated Desert Storm B-52s.
right.
So a couple of years after that, Soviet Union was dissolved. The ostensible global threat level was reduced to the point where I guess the expense couldn't be justified any longer.
You know, it is.
Was?
After every war, the United States decides we don't need a military anymore. And
Right.
the Cold War is no different. Right.
Right.
We got back from Desert Storm in 91. By December of 91, the squadron that I had been a part of since 1983 was gone.
Just decommissioned.
Yeah. They moved the unit number to an airlift number. We were the 97th Bomb Wing. The unit up at Altus became the 97th Airlift Wing. So they tried to move some of the tradition there. But all of our, in pursuit of a treaty with the Russians, they took all our G model bombers and broke them up into pieces. It was
the waste.
criminal.
Oh, God.
It was criminal. It was literally heartbreaking for me, for all of
Oh,
us.
I'm sure it
Just,
was.
you know,
God.
to see
These
those
things are such beautiful objects that work so well. It's kind of like Obama's, what did he call that thing where they cash for clunkers?
Yeah.
Where they'd buy your Corvette and pour concrete into the engine block.
It's hard to explain to somebody that hasn't been intimate with a combat airplane, but you know they had a B-52 on display out here at Shepherd Air Force Base, static display. Those things actually belonged on any Air Force static display you see belongs to the Air Force Museum, right? And the Air Force Museum has a team who regularly inspect those to make sure they're still safe and everything. And one time they inspected that one up there and decided it was corroded beyond repair.
Really?
And so the one that sits out there now is a replacement. The one that was there was a D model, a tall tail. Well, they came along with one of those big machines they used to rip apart buildings, because how else are you going to tear apart a B-52? You know, but you know the big things with big claws and stuff.
Right.
And they tore that thing into pieces in place there. I could hardly drive by there.
Oh, God.
It was like it was emotionally like looking at a torn up human body to me.
Just chunks of this beautiful airplane.
And you're looking at metal that has never seen the light of day, and now it's laid naked out in the sun out there. It was depressing to me.
Yeah, I can understand.
It surprised me, kind of, but it was an emotional thing to see that. And now they've replaced it, though, with a G model, which is, you know, at least a model that I've flown. And I may have flown that airframe. I don't know. I never kept a logbook. I really, really regret that.
Right.
I'd like to see a picture of one and go look up my book and go, yeah, I did fly that one, you know.
Right.
But I was too lazy. So. But
Didn't know it would be an issue.
Yeah. But, yeah, back to your question. As soon as Desert Storm was done, Congress began another base realignment and closing thing. And SAC was the first victims. Right?
Wow.
We had a chief of staff of the Air Force named General McPeak, who oversaw the.
So LeMay was gone by now. When did
he
LeMay die?
I don't know. I don't remember.
86 or something like that.
90, I think.
90.
Was it 90? You looked that up.
You know, till the very end, he was held in very high esteem. Military people were scared to death of him when he was. Before he died, you know, because he was connected.
Was in bed.
He knew everybody that had been president since Roosevelt personally.
Yeah,
you know, he's remained immensely powerful, and in SAC, his word was still law. There was a rumor went around there that we had a sink SAC who was going to make us wear blue flight suits, and the story I heard is when LeMay became aware of that, and of course he'd been retired for decades. He picked up the phone and called him and said, "You're not doing that," and we didn't.
You were in green flight suits.
Yeah.
And he thought blue was too Air Force like.
Make you look like a gas station attendant. You know?
Didn't look military enough.
Right. Yeah. He was.
But he just, despite being retired,
he remained very, very influential.
He remained in charge of SAC.
One of the best wing commanders I ever worked for. He had if you sat in front of the wing commander's desk and looked at him, behind him and above his head, he had this beautifully hand-lettered sign in Gothic lettering, and it said, "In the beginning there was Courtesy LeMay, and he created God."
Oh God!
That's pretty much how we felt about him in the command. He was a legendary guy, you know.
Oh, he's one of those people that shaped a lot of policy and a lot of lives and a lot of deaths and
Yep. Yeah.
historic figure.
Guy who understood how to use the
Gigantic
military.
man.
Yeah. Yeah, he flew. He began flying way back right after World War I, and flew up into the jet age, and
He personally was in the air for 50 years.
Yeah, yeah. What a guy! He was just one of those historical characters,
Right.
just a giant.
Yeah.
But yeah, Sack was finally. I think the assassination was complete probably by. Say, I moved to Texas in '92. So I think '93 was the year it officially went away, if I remember right. And I could, if we could drive to Northeast Arkansas, I could take you to within 10 feet of where I was standing the day the Cold War ended.
Right.
Because I had been gone for a week, temporary duty for a week. Came back on Friday, and the squadron commander says, congratulations, you've been chosen to ramrod the fundraising car wash in the parking lot at the BX tomorrow. And I said, why me? Because you weren't here to defend yourself. So, okay. So I stand that part, and of course, slave labor was provided by the guys on alert. I always had a ready labor force from them. Mm-hmm. And they're out there washing cars. And when you're on alert, you're carried around a little FM radio receiver with you. So it was just a receiver, not a transmitter. And when that thing went off, everybody would freeze because you had to listen to what it's going to say. Right? Well, we're out there washing cars. It's probably 1 p.m., something like that. And the alert radios go off, and somebody comes up and says, stand by for a message from SINCSAC. And I don't remember who SINCSAC was anymore at the time, but he comes on and essentially says, he gives about a 3-minute speech, but it ends with, uncock your nuclear bombers by 2100 Central Time and go home. And I had this sensation of stand on the edge of a cliff, The younger guys all cheered. All of us older guys went, oh, shit.
What just happened?
Yeah, nothing good's going to happen now, And we weren't wrong. Things changed at that instant. I could take you to within 10 feet of it, where I was standing, because it was that earth-shattering. It was like where I was when Kennedy was assassinated or something like that, because the world I'd grown up in ended right there, just suddenly,
Chopped off at the knees. Just.
Yeah. And in a lot of our opinion, the Air Force lost a lot of its way at that moment. Mm-hmm. Got to be careful what I say. I work for the Air Force still.
Right. Well, when did you actually separate?
I retired in '94 because of that drawdown of the bombers. So
you've been retired for 25 years.
Yep. The drawdown of those bombers meant I had to spend my last 2 years at Dyess Air Force Base in Abilene, Texas, working in the command post there. And I had to be happy with that because that same chief of staff, who I shall not mention again, had put out an edict that said if you have a certain level of flying experience and your base closes, you're never going to fly again. So at the end, the 340th Bomb Squadron...
How does that make any sense?
It doesn't.
What was the purpose of that?
He said we had too many pilots.
Yeah. He just wanted you off the payroll, essentially.
Yeah. And so the way he was going to thin it out was that, because there was a list of like 15 bases are going to close in the next 2 years. So this is going to get a lot of pilots out, at least off the flight deck. So I had other specialties and non-flying specialties, and I was trying to get up to Minot, which was one of the last 2 B-52 bases. The wing commander, there was a guy I had known years earlier, and I called him up, and he said, if you can get here, I'll put you on instructor orders when your feet touch down. But you got to get here against this thing from the chief of staff. So far from being excess pilots, Barksdale in Louisiana, which is the other B-52 base now, they were so desperate for experienced instructor pilots that they were paying out of their funds to have me and the squadron commander rotate down there a week at a time each. And they were paying for that. And the squadron commander and I were the last, we were it for the 340th Bomb Squadron. And he said, when you're home, you got to go into the office and we got to keep up the illusion that there's a squadron there. So I was home one day, and the phone rang, and I answered it, and I said, 340th Bomb Squadron, Captain Davison, and it's this one-star general. He asked for Colonel Sullivan, who's my boss. I said, he's TDY, sir, can I help you? And he said, who are you again? And I said, Captain Davison. And he says, yeah, you'll do. You and Sullivan are going to cease and desist this crap right now. You're going to take the next assignment we send you. You're going to be grateful you're getting pensions at all. Am I clear? Words to that effect.
Yeah.
So after I hung up, I thought, I'll bet that chief of staff himself pissed in that guy's cornflakes to be that angry with some low-ranking guy like me,
Yeah.
So I had to call Colonel Sullivan and tell him to enjoy his last ride because we're screwed. And that's when I knew I'd had my last ride. I was down there at Barksdale.
They found it necessary to make a phone call like that.
Yeah. I guess we were pissing off people,
What a deal. God almighty.
So I had to go to Dias, and I took solace in the fact that at least I'm working the command post and talking to airplanes and doing operational things because I knew guys, thousands of instructor hours that had to retrain as a finance officer or something. Just kill me.
Yeah.
Just shoot me in the head. For a pilot to do that,
Oh, God. How disgraceful.
Yeah. So I had to work hard. They had just enough officers to keep that place open. That command post at Dias. And so for the last 2 years, nobody got any leave. We worked 6 12-hour shifts in a row, and then we'd get 24 hours off. And we'd start it again. Because the command post had a higher level of cryptography in it that required the presence of a commissioned officer 24/7. So we had to man it, period. And we had just enough people to do it. So,
Oh, God.
It was like I say, I had to just be satisfied it wasn't finance or civil engineering or something,
Well, and since then, what have you been doing? You're an instructor at Shepherd right now.
I am. Yeah, I applied to do anything when I retired because, no surprise, it was pretty hard to get hired when you're 42 years old. I got a 20-year-old history degree, and I've been flying bombers. What civilian job is,
right? Yeah.
Besides the airlines, which I had no interest in at all. So I found out.
I guess they might have been interested in the guy that had flown heavies, right? Is that?
If I had tried to make myself attractive to them, I would have hireable. But I'm just not interested in that job at all.
Right.
Watching a computer fly airplanes, I don't want to do that.
Right.
So, but my daughter was just 5. I had mouths to feed. So I found out that despite the jokes we told each other for 20 years, McDonald's really isn't hiring me. Because that was what we'd always say. You don't like this, McDonald's is hiring.
Right.
But no, they're not hiring me. So I finally got hired to operate a cold reduction steel mill by Huntco Steel Company. And when I asked the hiring guy, why me? I don't know anything about steel. And you had 250 applicants for 15 jobs. And he said, you don't know how a steel mill runs, do you? I said, no. He said, it's run with a joystick, like an airplane. That's why we hired you. There's somebody who knows how to operate. And he was kind of right. I spent just under a year working there, worst job I ever had. Most dangerous job ever. Way more dangerous.
Way more dangerous than flying
combat
B-52s.
airplanes around. Oh, God, yes. 1,000 ways to get killed in a steel mill. And then I got a phone call. I'd worked 13 straight 12-hour shifts. And I was home for the first time in 2 weeks. I got a phone call offering me a job as a contractor at Shepherd teaching in the classroom at pilot training. Just academics. Didn't have any simulators here at the time. Going to pay me 3 times as much and work in air-conditioned classrooms. And I said, let me think about it. Okay, I'll go. So I was a contractor for the Air Force for 15 years. Then under the Obama administration, the government unilaterally canceled the contract and told us if we wanted to keep our jobs, we could apply to be government employees. So the job shifted from contract to government employee. Those of us who could afford to do so quit. None of us wanted to do this. Some of us who've been at the company for 15 years took a huge pay cut to do this. But the job is too good, and by then, by 2010, we had all these flight simulators out here, new airplane, the T6, that none of us had ever flown. A really great flight simulator, and so the job expanded out of the classroom and into the simulators too.
So it got more interesting.
Yeah, it did, a lot more interesting. And so that's what I've been doing then. So that means I joined the Air Force when I was 17. I'm 67 now. I've been away from the Air Force for about 1 year. And retiring was one of the more terrifying things I ever did.
Well, I'll bet.
I was scared for 6 months. I didn't know how to be a civilian. I didn't.
No. I mean, your whole adult life had been spent.
Yeah. It was terribly frightening for me. And
under this structure.
And I was unemployed for months when I found out how unhireable I was. And literally, McDonald's wasn't interested. They want to hire a 17-year-old kid, and if he quits after 2 shifts, they're not out anything.
Right.
But a guy in his 40s is going to leave. There's a 100% chance.
Right.
He's not going to stay here.
He's not interested in your assistant manager position.
No. I would have taken it because I needed a job, but
Right.
no, I'm not going to stay there.
Right.
You know, so that was a pretty depressing time for me.
Yeah.
Out of work and history degree. You know what good that does. You.
That-
I have a friend who's an aerodynamic. I have a number of friends who are aero engineers. A lot of pilots did that in college. He gave me my two favorite jokes about it. He said, "How do you make the history major's car more aerodynamic?" I said, "I don't know. I'll bite. Take that Pizza Hut sign off the top." How do you get the history major off your front step? I don't know. Pay for the pizza.
Pay for the pizza.
And that's what I found out is
Yeah,
pretty much true.
Pretty much the case.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
I'd majored in history because I found it easy. 'Cause to me, college was just stood between me and pilot training. That's its sole function.
Right. When did you become a military history buff? Because you are an expert in that field, and I don't know if
by the
you'd
time
be
I was
considered
7
an
or 8
expert, but it's been an interest of yours for a long, long time, and you know quite a bit about all of that stuff, about military history. And
I got interested when I was 5 and 6 years old, and when other kids were reading Dr. Seuss, I was reading history books. I didn't read a fiction book for my own pleasure until I was in my 20s, and that was a Louis L'Amour Western.
Mm-hmm.
Until then, the only fiction I'd ever read was assigned in school, that I had to read.
Right.
So this just always interested me, and I can't explain it other than the occasional war story from my dad, who fought in World War II. He was in the 10th Armored Division, and so he was under Patton. He was surrounded in Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, was wounded, and saw the whole thing from the ground. And
Right.
he didn't tell a lot of stories.
Our dads might have known each other.
It's entirely possible. He was in Bastogne, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. He spent Christmas Eve in Bastogne.
Yeah.
He was the mess officer mess sergeant in headquarters company. And so your dad stopped in to eat. My dad fed him.
May have. That's right. Yeah, you can read a number of history books before you find out that the 10th Armored was there in Bastogne.
Right.
The books always only talk about 101st Airborne. But the 10th Armored was sent up there because they knew the attack was coming, and the airborne guys only had sidearms, essentially.
Yeah.
So the 10th Armored was the nearest heavy unit. Patton was told to detach it and send it up there.
Right.
He got there just in time to get surrounded in Bastogne. And he always said that wasn't the toughest part of the war as far as he was concerned. He says it got tougher when we crossed the Rhine because now the Germans are fighting on home territory.
It meant more to him.
Right.
Right.
And this is in France. We just kind of raced across he says, most days we would drive till somebody shot at us. And then we'd back up because it's thin armor on a half track. We'd back up and let the tanks, the artillery, the planes take care of it. And when they dealt with it, we drove till somebody shot at us. So he used to tell me the front line was right there on my front bumper. That was the front line of the war. And so France was mostly just driving. It just wasn't a lot of shooting that he saw.
Just a transit.
Yeah.
Right.
But after he crossed the bridge at Remagen before it collapsed. Crossed it under air attack, as a matter of fact. That's what he said. He saw the first jets attacking that
They
bridge.
had them in the air in 44, didn't they?
Yeah. He said they'd been told about them, so they knew what they were when they
Right.
saw them and heard them. But they were pretty surprised how fast they were. They found out that their 50 caliber machine guns couldn't traverse fast enough to track them. So they just had to put rounds out in front of them, what pilots call a deflection shot.
Leading a duck.
Right.
Right.
So I think maybe that's why I got interested in all this.
Right.
He was a draftee. It's not like I come from a military family, but I just remember I couldn't tell you when it started, but I always had the sensation that being in the military is important, has meaning.
Right.
And I never
It
lost
certainly
that.
has throughout history, has it not?
There's a reason why it's the
History
world's
is a
second oldest profession.
History is just a succession of military activities.
Yep.
In fact.
And in Western worlds, after the end, each one we think it's never going to happen again, and we defund the military. And
Yeah. And sure enough, we end up being wrong.
but nobody knows anything about history, surprised by it.
Right. Exactly.
Because there's always somebody out there that wants your stuff and doesn't want to pay for it.
Right. We probably droned on long enough. I've been trying to get you to write a book about this shit for about 10 years, and I'm serious. It'll sell, and you're going to find out. You're going to find out. Thank you, Scott.
You're welcome.
Thanks for being my buddy.
Hey, yeah. Thank you for training me, saving my life.
Yeah, we talked about Scott on the podcast with Dr. Manji, and doesn't miss a workout. Just amazing what this shit will do for you. Thank you guys for watching us on Starting Strength Radio. Hope this has been enjoyable to you as it has for me. And we'll see you next time.